The history we know is often a carefully selected and retold narrative that has been shaped over the centuries by a variety of factors, from political ambitions and nationalistic aspirations to artistic liberties and simple human ignorance. We are accustomed to trusting textbooks, popular movies, and even everyday expressions that seem to reflect unshakable truths about the past. However, as we delve deeper into authentic historical evidence and the results of modern research, we inevitably encounter a startling reality. Many of the facts that we have firmly believed for decades and even centuries are in fact nothing more than persistent myths, misconceptions, or deliberate lies. These misconceptions penetrate deep into the collective consciousness, becoming part of our cultural code and imperceptibly shaping our worldview, influencing how we perceive not only the past, but also the present and even the future. The purpose of this series of articles is not just to debunk a few popular misconceptions, but to look beyond the veil of familiar images and stereotypes to see history in its authentic, often much more complex and intriguing form. We will take a journey through time and culture to analyze how and why these myths originated, who and why contributed to their spread, and what real facts were hidden or distorted in the process. From mythical images of ancient warriors to re-evaluating entire historical eras and personalities, we will discover that history is much richer and more multifaceted than we thought. Breaking down these historical misconceptions is not an act of negation of the past, but rather an act of liberation. It allows us not only to restore justice to forgotten or distorted figures and events, but also to learn to be more critical of information, develop independent thinking, and ultimately gain a deeper, more nuanced, and accurate understanding of how our world came to be what it is. There is one. Get ready to say goodbye to some cozy but misguided notions and discover a more exciting and true picture of the human past. The myth of the horned Viking helmets, the romanticization of barbarism and fiction that has distorted history for centuries. When the image of a Viking comes up in the modern mind, it almost automatically conjures up the image of a powerful, bearded warrior brandishing an axe or sword, wearing an impressive helmet with huge, menacing horns sticking out of it. This image is so firmly and deeply ingrained in our popular culture, from Richard Wagner's epic operas and their stage incarnations to countless cartoons, comics, fantasy novels, video games, and historical reenactments, often misguided, that it seems an integral and authentic part of the image of these Scandinavian sailors and warriors. Many people sincerely believe that horned helmets were everyday, or at least combat equipment of the Vikings, symbolizing their ferocity and savagery. Moreover, ETs and helmets are often presented as something that gave them an intimidating appearance, designed to demoralize the enemy. However, it is a striking but indisputable historical fact that there is absolutely no archaeological, historical, or pictorial evidence that Vikings ever wore horned helmets in battle, in everyday life, or even during ceremonial rituals. This seemingly unshakable attribute is nothing more than one of the most enduring and widespread historical lies, a product of the imagination and artistic fiction of the 19th century, and not the result of authentic excavations, ancient texts, or images of the Viking Age. The roots of this large-scale historical lie do not go back to the harsh times of the early Middle Ages, when Vikings terrified European shores from about the end of the winery to the middle of the 19th century, but much later in the 19th century, during the rapid flowering of Romanticism and nationalism. This period was characterized not only by the Industrial Revolution and social upheavals, but also by a deep interest in the past, especially in heroic and barbaric eras that could be used to shape national identity and pride. During this period, many European countries, including Scandinavia and Germany, sought to revive and glorify their ancient, barbaric, or primitive past by creating grandiose national myths and cultural symbols. It was in this context that this iconic but completely unhistorical image was born in 1876 during the first Bayreuth Festival in Germany, which presented Richard Wagner's famous opera tetralogy, The Ring of the Nibelung. The costume designer, Karl Emil Doppler, was responsible for creating the visual appearance of the characters inspired by ancient German mythology and the Norse sagas that formed the basis of the opera. He decided to create helmets with horns for Vikings and other Germanic warriors to give them a more spectacular and archaic look. However, it should be emphasized that Doppler did not do this on the basis of any authentic historical data. The study of ancient manuscripts, images of that era, or archaeological finds that would indicate the wearing of horned helmets by Vikings. His motivation was exceptional, artistic, and dramatic. Doppler sought to create the most effective, impressive, and even exotic image that would correspond to the general idea of the 19th century about the wild northern barbarians. Powerful, ferocious, a little mysterious, and perhaps even mystical. Horns, as an ancient symbol of strength, courage, fertility, and primitiveness, fit perfectly into this romanticized and theatrical concept. They evoked associations with bulls, deer, and other strong animals, emphasizing the supposed animal scum and ferocity. This image, created for the opera stage, was so powerful and visually appealing that it was instantly picked up and actively replicated by other artists, illustrators who worked for popular publications, writers who created historical novels, and even historians who wrote for the general public in the genre of popular literature. It became incredibly popular because it fit perfectly into the romanticized and often exaggerated narrative of the Vikings as fearless, almost mythical conquerors whose savagery was symbolized by their unusual clothing. The horned helmet soon became ubiquitous, easily recognizable, and most importantly, misinterpreted as a historically authentic Viking symbol, so firmly rooted in the culture that it was no longer perceived as an indisputable historical fact. This visual association was stronger than any academic research. However, archaeological evidence from decades of extensive excavations in Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the territories visited by Vikings strongly refute this myth. Not a single battle helmet with horns was found in any of the numerous Viking burials, battle sites, or hoards. The actual Viking helmets that were found, such as the famous and almost completely preserved helmet from Gjermundbu in Norway, dating back to the 10th century, were completely different. They were simple, but extremely functional and pragmatic, designed solely to protect the head in real combat. These helmets usually consisted of iron or leather caps, sometimes riveted from several parts, with a characteristic protection for the nose, the so-called nanosheet, and sometimes with protection for the eyes and cheeks, often supplemented with a chainmail bar mitzvah for the neck and lower part of the face. They were relatively light, streamlined, and provided maximum efficiency in close combat, where speed, maneuverability, and the absence of unnecessary protruding parts were critical. The horns, of course, would only be a hindrance in the thick of the fight. They could catch on branches, weapons of the enemy, make it difficult to move in a tight formation or in close quarters of ships, and most dangerously, they could become a convenient lever for the enemy to pull the helmet off the warrior's head or even injure his neck. Although some ancient ceremonial headdresses or cult artifacts from the Bronze Age, a period that predates the Viking Age by thousands of years, may indeed have had horns, such as the famous helmet from Vexa, these were purely ritual or cult items, not intended to be worn in battle, and they have no direct relation to human history, to the Vikings. Thus, what began as an artistic license designed to enhance the dramatic effect on the theater stage and correspond to romanticized ideas turned into a generally accepted but absolutely incorrect historical fact. This example clearly demonstrates how art, popular culture, and even national propaganda can profoundly distort reality and create an extremely persistent myth that can live on for centuries, despite all academic and archaeological refutations. This case serves as an important reminder of the need to take a critical approach to the visual images and narratives that shape our view of the past, and how easily the truth can be buried under layers of fiction. Dark Ages, an era of darkness, ignorance, or a period of fundamental transformation and undervalued progress. The term Dark Ages, or sometimes Dark Ages of the Middle Ages, used to describe the period of European history that followed the tragic fall of the Western Roman Empire, approximately from the 5th to the 10th centuries AD, has long been strongly associated in the mass consciousness with a drunken and hopeless intellectual and cultural stagnation, widespread ignorance, the reign of barbarism, social chaos, and a complete lack of any meaningful progress. According to this widely held but apparently deeply flawed concept, after the brilliant rise and greatness of the Roman Empire, known for its achievements in law, engineering, philosophy, and art, Europe was supposedly plunged into a millennium of intellectual darkness and chaos, where knowledge was lost, cities emptied, and civilization declined. It was believed that only the majestic flowering of the Renaissance, which returned Europe to the ancient ideals of light and reason, brought it out of this hopeless state. This negative, extremely simplistic, and, as we now understand, fundamentally unfair assessment of the period was actively promoted and consolidated by Enlightenment intellectuals in the 16th century. Enlightenment thinkers, obsessed with the ideas of reason, progress, and individual liberties, sought to contrast their age of reason, scientific discovery, and social reform with the supposed darkness, religious dogmatism, and barbarism of the preceding medieval ages. They used the term Dark Ages as a rhetorical device to exalt their own ideals and achievements, creating a sharp but essentially false contrast with the supposedly backward past, thereby discrediting the entire Middle Ages. However, in recent decades, thanks to tremendous progress in historical research, archaeology, historiography, and the emergence of new, more nuanced approaches to the study of the past, modern historians have long and decisively refuted this simplified, overly negative, and fundamentally unfair assessment of the so-called Dark Ages. Although the regions of Western Europe have certainly experienced a period of significant upheaval, fragmentation of political power, urban decline, and decentralization since the collapse of the Roman Empire, which led to a decline in literacy rates and the loss of some technologies, it is unfair and historically inaccurate to speak of complete stagnation or gloom. On the contrary, this period was a time of incredibly complex and dynamic transformation, when the old Roman structures were being destroyed under the onslaught of barbarian tribes and internal crises, but at the same time new states, such as the Frankish kingdom, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, new social orders, feudalism, new cultural identities, mixing of the Roman peoples, were actively forming, German and Christian heritage, and new economic systems. It was during these Dark Ages that the foundations of most modern European nations and languages, as well as political and legal systems, were laid. In fact, the Dark Ages were a period of significant, though often not as obvious or grandiose as in antiquity or the Renaissance, development in various fields. For example, Christian monasteries, they played an absolutely key and irreplaceable role in preserving and transmitting the classical ancient heritage. At a time when secular libraries and schools were falling into disrepair, monks diligently and methodically copied and preserved not only religious texts, but also a huge number of works by ancient Greek and Roman authors, philosophers, historians, poets, scientists, engineers. It is thanks to their painstaking work that many of these priceless manuscripts, which otherwise would have been irretrievably lost, have come down to us. Monasteries became real centers of education, intellectual life, and culture in the face of the general degradation of urban life and the decline of secular educational institutions. Particularly prominent in this process were the Irish and Anglo-Saxon monks, who, being on the periphery of the former Roman Empire, were not so much affected by the constant barbarian invasions and were able to preserve a rich intellectual tradition and then spread it throughout Europe. In addition to preserving knowledge, new architectural styles were actively developed during this period, such as Carolingian architecture, which became an important precursor to the later Romanesque and Gothic styles. New agricultural technologies, revolutionary for their time, appeared and were introduced, selskahozijstvenie technology, which significantly increased labor productivity and contributed to population growth and therefore to economic development. Among them, the invention and widespread use of the heavy plow, which with the help of wheels and deep plowing, made it possible to cultivate denser and wetter European soils, making previously unsuitable land suitable for agriculture. Another key innovation was the introduction of the three-field system, which allowed for more efficient use of land, alternating winter, spring crops, and steam, which significantly increase productivity and preserve soil fertility. These innovations have provided a much more stable food supply and have become the foundation for future demographic and economic growth in Europe. A cultural and intellectual renaissance, known as the Carolingian Renaissance in the 8th and 9th centuries, under the patronage of Charlemagne, is another striking example of the fact that this period was far from a general decline. At this time, not only was Latin literacy and classical culture revived, but also legislation was systematized. Schools and churches were built, art, miniatures, and architecture were developed, and an extensive network of monastic libraries was created. Thus, the Dark Ages were not a period of absolute decline and gloom, as they are often depicted in popular culture, but a complex, dynamic, and extremely important time of fundamental transformation. This was the period when the foundation was laid for the future great achievements of Europe, when its unique civilizational features, including legal systems, languages, and national identities, were formed. The myth of the darkness was, in fact, an ideological construct designed to magnify subsequent epochs, rather than a plentiful historical reflection of real events. Understanding this allows us to look at the Middle Ages not as a faceless void between two golden ages, but as a vital, active, and often innovative stage in human history, full of its own challenges, achievements, and struggle for survival, which directly led to the formation of the modern Western world. The destruction of this myth allows us to see the continuity of the historical process and objectively assess the huge contribution of each stage to the development of human civilization. The Great Wall of China, invisible from space in its antiquity in its current form. The image of the Great Wall of China is one of the most powerful and recognizable symbols of China, embodying its thousand-year history, engineering genius, and defensive power. It is presented as a continuous, colossal structure stretching for thousands of kilometers, built 1,000 years ago and visible even from space with the naked eye. This image is deeply ingrained in the minds of people around the world, becoming a kind of fact that is rarely questioned. However, upon closer inspection, it turns out that many of these commonly held beliefs about the Great Wall of China are nothing more than persistent myths that distort its true history and scope. The most common and persistent myth is that the Great Wall of China is visible from space to the naked eye. This statement is often found in books, articles, and even textbooks, but it is completely untrue. The first cosmonauts and astronauts, including Neil Armstrong, have repeatedly stated that the wall is not visible from Earth's orbit. Famous Chinese-American astronaut Leroy Chiao, who saw the wall from the International Space Station, confirmed that it is barely visible and requires very specific lighting conditions and visual acuity to be seen. Unlike wide highways or artificial lakes, which have a large area and clear borders, the wall, despite its length, is relatively narrow and has a color that merges with the surrounding landscape. Its average width is only about 6 to 9 meters, which makes it almost indistinguishable from the height of the orbit, comparable to looking at a thread from a great height. This misconception probably arose from hyperbole and the desire to emphasize the grandeur of the structure, but over time, it turned into a fact. The second significant myth concerns the continuity and antiquity of the Great Wall in its present form. Many present it as a single, continuous structure built by one dynasty in a relatively short period. In fact, the Great Wall of China is not a single structure, but a complex system of defensive structure consisting of many walls, ramparts, trenches, towers, and forts, which were built and rebuilt over more than 2 millennia, starting from the 7th century BC and ending with the 17th century AD. Different dynasties built their sections of the wall, often using different materials and technologies, and in different locations, which led to the fact that many sections were not connected to each other, and some were even located parallel to each other. The most famous and well-preserved sections of the wall, the buildings that we see today, were built during the Ming Dynasty of 1368-1644. It is the Ming Wall, built of brick and stone, with its distinctive watchtowers and battlements, that forms the main part of what modern tourists perceive as the Great Wall. Earlier sites, such as those built during the Qin Dynasty, 3rd century BC, under the Qin Shi Huang Emperor, were much more primitive, often consisting of earthen ramparts, compacted layers of soil and gravel that eventually collapsed or were absorbed by nature. Thus, although the concept of a defensive wall on China's northern border has been around for thousands of years, the specific structure that we perceive as the Great Wall of China is largely a creation of the Ming Dynasty. The myth that the wall was built at the same time and by the same people also does not stand up to criticism. The construction was carried out by many generations of Chinese, from ordinary peasants and soldiers to prisoners and slaves under the leadership of various dynasties. Working conditions were unbearable, and many construction workers died from exhaustion, disease, and accidents, giving rise to tragic legends about the longest cemetery in the world. However, this was not a one-time project, but rather an ongoing process of construction, renovation, and expansion in response to changing threats from nomadic tribes from the north. These myths about the Great Wall of China, while giving it an extra aura of grandeur, actually detract from the true complexity and historical significance of this grandiose project. Understanding that the wall is the product of centuries-old efforts of different dynasties, not a single miracle, and that its invisibility from space is just hyperbole, allows us to better appreciate it as a symbol of perseverance, strategic thinking, and adaptation of Chinese civilization. It is also a reminder of how easily an actual story can be replaced with a simpler and more effective legend, which is then passed on as an unquestionable truth. Debunking these myths does not detract from the wall's grandeur. It only adds new layers of historical depth and authenticity to it. The Spanish Inquisition, the myth of universal brutality and millions of victims. When it comes to the Spanish Inquisition, most people think of it as a relentless, ubiquitous, and incredibly violent organization that burned heretics at the stake en masse, subjected people to elaborate tortures, and was responsible for millions of deaths. This image, which is widely spread in literature, art, and especially in popular culture, has created a persistent stereotype of the Spanish Inquisition as a kind of apotheosis of religious fanaticism and medieval cruelty. It is often presented as something unique in its ferocity and scale of repression. However, modern historical research, based on a thorough analysis of archival documents, refutes many of these exaggerations and exposes them as part of the Black Legend, a disinformation campaign aimed at discrediting Catholic Spain. It is important to understand that the Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 by the Catholic kings Ferdinand II and Isabella I, was a unique institution that was different from the Papal Inquisition that operated in other parts of Europe. It was under the direct control of the Spanish monarchy, not the Pope, and its main goal was to ensure religious unity in the United Kingdom of Spain, especially after the Reconquista and the mass conversion of Jews and Muslims to Christianity, the so-called conversos and moriscos. The main task of the Inquisition was to combat heresy, or rather, the secret confession of Judaism or Islam by those who publicly converted to Catholicism, as well as Protestantism, which became a threat in the 15th century. The myth of millions of victims is one of the most blatant exaggerations. Data from contemporary historians such as Henry Kamen, Jean-Pierre Devisay, and Gustave Henningsen, who have systematically studied the available inquisitorial archives, and they are quite well preserved, show much more modest and, although tragic, not astronomical figures. During the entire period of the Spanish Inquisition, from 1478 to 1834, the number of death sentences carried out by burning at the stake, auto da fe, is estimated at approximately $3,000, $5,000 a person. At the same time, the total number of people who have passed through the courts of the Inquisition is about $150,000, 200,000 people, most of whom received less severe punishments, such as penance, imprisonment, confiscation of property, or wearing shameful clothing, San Benito. Of course, each such execution was a tragedy, but these figures are by no means close to the millions that myths so often speak of, and significantly less than the number of victims of religious wars or ordinary courts in other European countries at that time. Another common myth is the widespread and sophisticated use of torture. Although torture was indeed used by the Inquisition, as well as by most of the judicial systems in Europe at the time, its use was strictly regulated and restricted. Torture was used not to extract a confession, since a confession obtained under torture was considered invalid without subsequent voluntary confirmation, but to obtain additional information or incriminate the suspect. There were strict rules. Torture could not be used twice on the same charge. It was not allowed tomayim, and it was not allowed to result in death. Inquisitors were also required to be present at tortures to make sure they met the rules. Historians estimate that torture was used in less than 10% of all cases tried by the Inquisition, which is significantly lower than in the secular courts of the time. In addition, the methods of torture themselves, although cruel by modern standards, rack, water torture, garrote, were not as sophisticated and widespread as they are portrayed by the Black Legend. The Black Legend about the Spanish Inquisition was deliberately formed and spread by Spain's political opponents. Protestant countries, the Netherlands, England, and later France in the 16th or 19th centuries. Its goal was to discredit the Spanish Empire, justify its colonial conquests, and present Catholicism as a backward and violent religion. This propaganda was so effective that its effects are still felt today. Thus, the Spanish Inquisition was certainly a repressive institution of its time, which persecuted and punished people for their religious beliefs, and its activities cannot be justified. However, it was not unique in its brutality or scale among the judicial systems of Europe of the 15th or 8th centuries, and its real scale is much smaller than it is commonly believed in popular culture. Debunking these myths allows us not only to gain a more accurate understanding of this complex historical phenomenon, but also to understand how historical narratives can be distorted for political purposes and how such lies can persist in the public consciousness for centuries. Dutch tulip mania. Was it really the first economic pyramid scheme? The history of Dutch tulip mania in the 17th century has firmly entered the public consciousness as a textbook example of the first major economic bubble in history, and often as a kind of financial pyramid. This event, which allegedly led to massive ruin and collapse of the Dutch economy due to speculation with tulip bulbs, which cost more than gold and real estate, became an edifying parable about the madness of the crowd and the danger of an uncontrolled market. This myth is taught in business schools, is mentioned in the financial news at every crisis, and even appears in fiction, forming the idea of some kind of irrational euphoria that has engulfed the entire Dutch society. However, despite its popularity, this narrative significantly exaggerates the scale and consequences of tulip mania, presenting more of a moralizing legend than an accurate historical description. The true history of tulips in the Netherlands begins at the end of the 16th century, when these exotic flowers were imported from the Ottoman Empire. Due to their rarity, bright colors, and especially the unique flame patterns on the petals caused by a viral infection, tulip mosaic virus, tulips quickly became a luxury item and a symbol of high status. By the 1630s, their popularity peaked, especially among wealthy merchants and aristocrats. The onion market did grow exponentially, especially on futures contracts, when people bought the right to an onion that had yet to be dug up. Prices for rare varieties, such as Semper August, actually reached astronomical values, equivalent to the cost of houses, land plots, or entire estates. This caused a stir, and many, seeing the rapid increase in prices, invested in bulbs, hoping for an easy and quick profit. However, a key aspect of tulipomania that is often misrepresented is its scale and impact on the entire Dutch economy. Despite the dramatic descriptions in popular sources, most historians, especially Peter Garber, in his book Excessive Hype and Irrational Euphoria, A History of Tulip Mania, have concluded that the tulip bubble was much smaller in scale and influence than is generally believed. Onion speculation was concentrated mainly in a narrow circle of wealthy merchants, nobles, and financiers, rather than covering all segments of the population. Ordinary farmers or artisans, for the most part, did not have access to the huge sums needed to participate in the trade of the most expensive varieties of tulips. It was a niche market for luxury goods, rather than an all-encompassing economic phenomenon. When the market collapsed in February 1637, mainly due to oversupply and awareness of price volatility, It certainly led to the ruin of some speculators and significant financial losses for those who invested heavily. But there was no nationwide economic collapse, banking system collapse, or mass impoverishment of the population, as is often portrayed. The Dutch economy, which at that time was at the peak of its golden age and had a powerful trading and financial system, successfully survived this episode. Long-term serious consequences. Many of those affected were able to recover, as their core assets were not affected. The myth of tulipomania as the first pyramid, or irrational euphoria, is largely due to the works of the English journalist Charles Mackay and his book, The Extraordinary Delusions of Crowds and the Madness of Crowds, 1841. Mackay, who is neither a professional historian nor does extensive archival research, has collected anecdotes and rumors to illustrate his ideas about human irrationality in financial matters. His dramatized and greatly exaggerated description of tulipomania was extremely popular and became the basis for subsequent retellings, consolidating the myth in the mass consciousness. In reality, tulip mania was more like a small bubble in a narrow luxury market that exploded, damaging only a small part of the rich population, but not undermining the foundations of one of the most prosperous economies of its time. It was much more akin to collectible speculation than the current financial crisis, and had nothing to do with the pyramid scheme, which involves fraudulently extracting funds from new investors to pay off old ones. Debunking this myth allows us to see that human delusions and speculative bubbles are not something unique for our time, but their scale and consequences must be assessed in the correct historical context, without succumbing to dramatic but incorrect retellings. Egyptian pyramids, built not by slaves but by free laborers and skilled artisans. The image of the Egyptian pyramids, these monumental wonders of the ancient world, is inextricably linked in the mass consciousness with the idea of their construction by millions of enslaved slaves who worked under the whip of overseers in the sweltering heat, dying from overwork. This tragic and dramatic image, often depicted in Hollywood films, historical novels, and even some textbooks, has become a symbol of ancient tyranny and human suffering. It is supported by the biblical stories of Israelite slaves in Egypt, although these stories are from a much later period and are not related to the construction of the monumental pyramids of the ancient kingdom. This myth is so deeply ingrained that it calls into question the very fact that it can be refuted. However, modern archaeological discoveries and reinterpretations of ancient Egyptian texts categorically refute this ingrained historical lie, proving that the pyramids were built not by mass slave labor, but by an army of free workers and highly skilled artisans. Key archaeological discoveries made in the 1990s in Giza, an area adjacent to the Great Pyramids, have completely changed our understanding of the builders of these colossal structures. During the excavations, extensive settlements of builders were discovered, dating back to about 2075 2465 BC, that is, the period of construction of the most famous pyramids of Cheops, Chephren, and Mykerinos. These settlements included not only residential areas for thousands of workers, but also bakeries, fish markets, breweries, medical institutions, and even cemeteries. Analysis of human remains found in these cemeteries showed that the deceased were healthy men and women who received a high-protein diet consisting of meat, beef, fish, beer, and bread. This is contrary to the idea of slaves, who are usually minimally fed and suffer from malnutrition. Moreover, the bones showed signs of heavy physical labor, but also evidence of qualified medical care, including signs of healed fractures and even amputations, indicating the presence of doctors in concern for the health of workers. The presence of separate burials for construction workers rather than mass unmarked graves is also important evidence. Slaves usually did not receive such reverence after death, and their bodies were simply thrown away or buried without proper honors. Further analysis showed that the workers were organized into highly structured teams that worked on a rotating basis. Their work was a form of public service, a kind of tax or duty for the benefit of Pharaoh and all of Egypt. These workers were probably seasonal workers, mobilized for periods when agricultural work was impossible due to the Nile floods. They were paid not in money, which did not exist in Egypt at that time, but in food, shelter, and clothing, which were very valuable and provided for their families. In addition, not only ordinary handymen, but also highly skilled artisans, worked on the construction of the pyramids, wysoce kwalificowani rzemieślniki stonemasons, engineers, architects, artists, carpenters, bakers, butchers. A whole army of specialists, without whom it would be impossible to build such complex and precise structures. These people were clearly not slaves. Their professionalism and concern for their well-being indicate a high social status and the importance of their work to the state. The origin of the pyramid-building slave myth is many-sided. It is partly related to biblical texts, in particular the Book of Exodus, which describes the enslavement of the Israelites in Egypt and their forced labor to build granary cities for Pharaoh. However, it is historically and archaeologically proven that these events, if they took place, are much later, New Kingdom, approximately 200 centuries BC, than the construction of the Great Pyramids, Ancient Kingdom, ex of 5th century BC. There is no archaeological evidence of the presence of a large number of ancient pyramids, Jewish slaves in the construction of the pyramids. Another reason is Greek historians, such as Herodotus, who visited Egypt thousands of years after the pyramids were built. His accounts of tens of thousands of slaves building the pyramids were based on stories he had heard and were probably exaggerated or misinterpreted. Europeans, when confronted with grandiose structures and not understanding the ancient Egyptian social structure, automatically attributed their construction to slave labor, since this corresponded to their ideas about Eastern despotisms and the scale of human possibilities. Hollywood blockbusters like The Ten Commandments only reinforce this dramatic but false image. Thus, the myth of pyramid-building slaves is not only incorrect, but also detracts from the true scope and complexity of ancient Egyptian labor organization, engineering, and social structure. The pyramids were a symbol of religious faith, state power, and unity, and their construction was a grand national project that brought the population together and provided employment for a huge number of people. Debunking this myth allows us to see a more complex and humane picture of ancient Egypt, where labor was organized according to the laws of ancient Egypt, on principles other than our usual slavery, and where the collective efforts of free citizens and skilled craftsmen have created one of the greatest wonders of the world. It is also a reminder of how easily a dramatic narrative can displace historical truth, especially when it is backed up by popular culture. The wrong shape of the earth. Belief in a flat earth and Columbus as a lone hero. One of the most widespread historical myths, deeply rooted in popular consciousness and even used as a metaphor for ignorance and retrogradism, is the claim that people in the Middle Ages believed in a flat earth and that Christopher Columbus was a lone pioneer hero who risked everything to challenge this commonly accepted dogma by proving roundness, plan your journey across the Atlantic. This narrative is presented as a story about the triumph of scientific progress and rational thinking over religious obscurantism. However, like many other seemingly obvious facts, this myth is a deep and multi-layered distortion of historical reality, which has no real basis. In fact, the vast majority of educated people in the Middle Ages, including scientists, philosophers, and theologians, were well aware that the Earth is shaped like a sphere. The idea of the Earth being spherical has been known since ancient Greece. Thinkers such as Pythagoras, Plato, and Aristotle wrote about the spherical shape of the Earth. Eratosthenes, who lived in the 3rd century BC, even calculated the circumference of the Earth very accurately, using trigonometry and shadow observation. This knowledge was not lost in the Middle Ages, as is often imagined. Leading medieval scholars and theologians, including such luminaries as St. Augustine, 4th to 5th centuries, Isidore of Seville, 6th and 7th centuries, Bede the Venerable, the 8th century, Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century, and John Sacrobosco, 13th century, explicitly mentioned and justified the spherical shape of the Earth in their writings. Sacrobosco's works, such as his Treatise on the Sphere, were standard textbooks on astronomy in European universities for many centuries, from the 13th century to the 17th centuries, which completely refutes the idea of a universal belief in a flat Earth. Even images of the Earth in medieval manuscripts, if they were not strongly stylized, often showed it as a sphere. The idea of a flat Earth in the Middle Ages was rather a marginal idea, perhaps existing among the most uneducated segments of the population or in the context of extremely simplified religious allegories. but not the dominant scientific or theological dogma. The second part of this myth is the idea of Christopher Columbus as a heroic visionary who single-handedly challenged the stagnant and ignorant representatives of the church and scientists to prove the spherical shape of the earth. This narrative, which credits Columbus with a unique understanding of the shape of the earth, is a key element of his romanticized image. However, this is also not true. Columbus, like most educated people of that time, knew that the earth was round. The point of contention between Columbus and scientists of his time, including ecclesiastical ones, was not the shape of the earth, but its size. Columbus used erroneous calculations based on the underestimated estimates of the ancient Greek geographer Ptolemy and the exaggerated data of the medieval Arab scholar al-Farghani to prove that the sea route from Europe to Asia via the Atlantic Ocean would be much shorter than it actually is. He estimated that the distance to Japan is only about 2,400 miles, whereas the actual distance across the ocean is about 10,000 miles. The scientists and advisors of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, on the other hand, relied on the more accurate calculations of Eratosthenes and other ancient and Arab geographers, which gave a much larger circumference of the Earth and consequently a much longer and more dangerous journey across the Atlantic. They did not doubt the spherical shape of the Earth, but they justly feared that the ships of Columbus would not be able to cover such a great distance without stopping in between, since the water and provisions would not be sufficient for such a long voyage. The refusal to fund his expedition was not due to their belief in a flat Earth, but to their well-founded doubts about his calculations, and consequently, the viability of his proposed route. Only Columbus's good fortune in finding America, which he mistook for Asia, saved him from certain destruction if he had to sail to the real Asia. The origin of this myth of the flat Earth in the Middle Ages and the hero Columbus is due to several factors. One of the key propagators of this lie was the American writer Washington Irving and his extremely popular but artistically embellished biography, The Life and Travels of Christopher Columbus, 1828. Irving, trying to create a fascinating and heroic story, deliberately dramatized Columbus's conflict with the church, depicting it as a bulwark of ignorance and belief in a flat Earth. This fictional confrontation was ideally suited to the Romantic literature of the 11th and 10th centuries, where progress and individual genius were pitted against conservative institutions. Another source of the myth was the historian Andrew Dixon White, and his book History of the Struggle Between Science and Theology in Christendom, 1896, which also exaggerated the conflict between science and religion, using the flat Earth myth as a prime example of religious suppression of scientific knowledge. These authors, unwittingly or unknowingly, laid the foundation for a myth that has since taken root in popular culture and education. Thus, the myth of the flat Earth in the Middle Ages and Columbus as its debunker is a deep misconception that does not correspond to historical facts. He distorts the reality of the Middle Ages by belittling the intellectual achievements of that era and overly politicizes Columbus by attributing to him a discovery that was actually known long before him. Debunking this myth allows us not only to gain a more accurate understanding of the scientific knowledge of the Middle Ages, but also to understand how historical narratives can be shaped by artistic freedom and ideological goals, creating stable but incorrect ideas about the past. This is a reminder of the need for a critical approach to sources of information and the value of authentic historical research. Medieval chastity belts, a tool of tyranny or a Victorian myth? The image of the chastity belt, a massive metal device supposedly worn by jealous knights on their wives before they left for the Crusades to guarantee their loyalty, is firmly ingrained in the mind as one of the darkest and most violent symbols of medieval tyranny and patriarchal oppression. This image often appears in popular films, historical novels, anecdotes, and even in the context of contemporary discourse on gender-based violence, providing a vivid illustration of the brutality and ignorance of that era. It is widely believed that these devices were a common element of marital life in the Middle Ages, serving as a guarantee of marital fidelity in the absence of husbands. However, despite its remarkable persistence and sinister appeal, the myth of widespread medieval chastity belts is one of the biggest and most persistent historical fabrications, a product of the Victorian imagination rather than actual medieval practice. A key and indisputable historical fact is that there is virtually no reliable evidence of the use of chastity belts in the Middle Ages. No authentic medieval chastity belts have been found in archaeological excavations. Ancient texts, court documents, personal letters, chronicles, and descriptions of everyday life of that time, despite their huge number and detail, rarely, if ever, mention such devices. If these belts were widely distributed, as is commonly believed, they would inevitably leave a significant mark on the material culture, legal documents, and literary works of the era. Their complete absence in archaeological finds and minimal mention in primary sources is in itself a powerful argument against their mass use. The vast majority of medieval chastity belts that can now be seen in museums or private collections are actually fakes created in the 19th century. It was in the Victorian era, mid-late 19th century, that this myth became widespread and visually embodied. Victorian society, with its double morality, paradoxical combination of sexual repression and hidden fetishes, has shown great interest in the supposed dark aspects of the Middle Ages. At this time, the practice of making fake historical artifacts for sale to collectors and museums flourished. Blacksmiths and craftsmen, in an effort to meet the demand for authentic medieval curiosities, created these intricate metal structures that perfectly fit into the Victorian ideas of cruelty and primitiveness of the past. These fakes were often put on public display, confirming the seemingly truthfulness of the legend. Moreover, Victorian literature, especially Gothic novels and erotic works, actively exploited the image of the chastity belt as a metaphor for oppression and female submission, which further cemented it in the collective imagination. In addition to making fakes, there were other reasons why the myth of chastity belts was so firmly rooted. Perhaps they were satirical or allegorical images. In rare medieval texts that were not intended for literal interpretation, but were only symbolic expressions of male fears of infidelity or female disobedience. Some researchers suggest that the chastity belt may have been a metaphor for virtue, loyalty, or even control over female sexuality in a broad sense, rather than a literal physical device. Moreover, the concept of the chastity belt may have been part of a broader black legend of the Middle Ages that developed during the Renaissance and Enlightenment, seeking to present the Middle Ages as an era of ignorance, cruelty, and obscurantism to emphasize the progress of new eras. From the point of view of practicality and functionality, the use of such belts in medieval conditions would be extremely impractical and even dangerous. Metal belts that are constantly in contact with the skin would lead to unbearable chafing, infections, rashes, and other serious health problems, especially in the absence of hygiene and adequate medicine. They would have been impossible to wear for a long time, and even more so in crusades that lasted for years. They would also be extremely inefficient for their intended purpose, as they could be easily removed with simple tools or even by physical impact. Finally, they would not provide chastity at all if a woman wanted to cheat, but would only create physical discomfort. Thus, the chastity belt as a widely used medieval artifact is nothing more than a fantasy that flourished in much later eras, especially in the Victorian era. This is a vivid example of how the modern view of the past can be distorted by moral biases, a desire to shock, or simply a lack of understanding of the realities of life. Debunking this myth not only restores a more accurate picture of medieval society, but also serves as an important lesson in how easily a sensational but false story can become the accepted truth, especially when it fits well with preconceived notions of dark times. The myth of the fall of the Roman Empire, not a sudden collapse, but a long evolution and transformation. The idea of the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was overthrown by the German leader Odoacer, is firmly established in the mass consciousness as one of the most dramatic and key events in history. It is associated with the sudden and complete collapse of a great civilization, plunging into chaos, barbarism, and the Dark Ages, as if a huge and powerful empire disappeared overnight. This narrative, often used as a warning about the fragility of civilization, evokes images of burning cities, destroyed institutions, in the complete disappearance of Roman influence. However, modern historians, based on decades of research and new interpretations of sources, unanimously argue that the concept of a fall as a single-stage catastrophic event is a significant simplification and, in fact, a myth. What we call the fall was actually a complex, multifactorial, and very long process of evolution and transformation that spanned several centuries. First, it is important to note that the date 426 AD is symbolic and convenient for textbooks, but it does not reflect the real picture. It marks only the end of the line of Western Roman emperors in Italy. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, centered in Constantinople, continued to exist for almost 1,000 years until 1453, preserving Roman traditions, law, culture, and institutions. Thus, the Roman Empire itself did not fall, but only its western part experienced profound changes. The process that led to the transformation of the Western Roman Empire was far from a sudden collapse. It was a gradual, centuries-old degradation and adaptation that began long before 476. Among the main factors contributing to this process are economic problems. Constant wars required huge resources, which led to depletion of the treasury, inflation, reduced trade, and urban decline. The Roman economy was dependent on slave labor and expansion, and when expansion stopped, stagnation began. Political crises and instability, frequent changes of emperors, sometimes several in a year, palace intrigues, civil wars, and the lack of a clear system of succession to the throne weakened the central government and undermined the loyalty of the population. Legions often put their own protégés on the throne, which made the army a political player and not just an instrument of the state. Demographic changes and migrations. Beginning in the 3rd century, various Germanic tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Burgundians, and others, fleeing from the Huns or attracted by Roman wealth, began to enter the empire en masse, first as federates, allies who were allowed to settle on Roman lands in exchange for military service, and then as conquerors. These migrations led to a change in the ethnic composition of the population, the loss of Rome's control over territories, and the formation of barbarian kingdoms within the former Roman borders. Military issues. The Roman army, once invincible, was gradually losing its effectiveness. It became increasingly dependent on barbarian mercenaries who were not always loyal to Rome. Constant pressure at the borders and the inability to effectively repel invasions led to the loss of territories and resources. Cultural and social changes. The spread of Christianity led to a change in value orientations, a reorientation of society from imperial cults to religious ones. The Roman aristocracy was losing interest in public service, preferring to focus on their estates, which led to a degradation of urban self-government. Epidemics and diseases. For example, the plague of Justinian in the 600th century, although it was later than 476, was part of a general cycle of epidemics that significantly reduced the population and undermined the economy. Thus, the fall was not so much a collapse as a long process of gradual decentralization, ruralization, and transformation. Roman institutions did not disappear overnight. Many elements of Roman administration, law, language, Latin, culture, and, of course, Christianity continued to exist and develop in new, barbarian kingdoms, such as the Visigothic kingdom in Spain, the Frankish kingdom in Gaul. Barbarian kings often sought to legitimize their power by emulating Roman emperors, accepting Roman titles, and maintaining Roman legal norms. The culture did not disappear, but changed, mixing with Germanic traditions, which eventually led to the formation of a unique medieval European civilization. The myth of a sudden and catastrophic fall was beneficial to Renaissance and Enlightenment intellectuals. For them, the Roman Empire was the golden age of reason and civilization, and the Middle Ages that followed the fall were presented as an era of ignorance and barbarism. The dramatic fall served as a convenient boundary between the light of antiquity and the darkness of the Middle Ages, emphasizing the idea of cyclical development of civilizations and the need for the revival of ancient ideals. This concept was actively promoted by historians of the 15th, the 3rd, and 19th centuries, forming the idea that still dominates popular culture. Understanding that the Roman Empire did not fall, but was transformed, is key to a more accurate understanding of history. This allows us to see the continuity of the historical process, to recognize that even in periods of apparent decline, new forms are emerging, and to avoid simplistic binary ideas about the good and bad in history. Instead of mourning the lost empire, we can study how its legacy, interwoven with new cultures, has laid the foundation for modern Europe. The myth of Mozart and Salieri, a drama of jealousy born out of fiction, not history. The image of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, a brilliant but underappreciated composer, and Antonio Salieri, his envious and incompetent contemporary, who allegedly poisoned Mozart out of jealousy, is deeply ingrained in the mass consciousness. This dramatic story, which has become a cultural archetype, was repeatedly embodied in literature, theater, and, most significantly, in cinema, in Milos Forman's Oscar-winning film Amadeus, 1984. In it, Salieri is presented as a villain obsessed with envy of Mozart's divine gift, and Mozart as the frivolous but brilliant enfant terrible. This myth doesn't just tell a story, but offers a convenient metaphor for the conflict between true, genuine genius and mediocrity trying to destroy what it can achieve. However, despite its artistic appeal and deep emotional impact, the idea of Mozart-Salieri's feud and poisoning is one of the most enduring and baseless historical slanders, based on hearsay and artistic fiction rather than actual historical facts. In fact, there is no reliable historical evidence to support the enmity between Mozart and Salieri, much less Salieri's involvement in Mozart's death. On the contrary, a careful analysis of the surviving documents, correspondence, diaries, and memoirs of contemporaries indicates that the relationship between the two composers was mostly correct, professional, and even friendly, although with a certain degree of rivalry, which was common in the musical circles of Vienna at that time. Both were leading figures in Viennese musical life, Mozart as an independent genius, Salieri as an influential and successful court Kapellmeister, teacher and director of the opera house, who enjoyed great patronage of Emperor Joseph II. Mozart and Salieri are known to have sometimes performed together, collaborated on joint projects, and even taught the same students. For example, Salieri gave music lessons to Mozart's son, Carl Thomas. They also attended the premieres of each other's works. In 1785, Salieri even conducted performances of some of Mozart's works. Although Salieri may have felt some professional jealousy of Mozart's talent, like many other composers of the time, this was a normal part of the competitive creative environment and did not develop into anger or attempts to harm. Mozart, for his part, sometimes criticized Salieri for his conservative musical views, but this was a creative criticism, not a personal one. Salieri, who was more senior and established in the hierarchy of court music, often provided Mozart with services, such as helping with productions of his operas. The myth of poisoning began to spread only after Mozart's death in 1791, when there were rumors of his unnatural demise. Mozart himself, shortly before his death, in a delirium, allegedly mentioned that he was poisoned, which was probably the result of fever and delirium caused by the disease. Mozart's disease was most likely the result of rheumatic fever. The disease was caused by a combination of other ailments that were common at the time due to a lack of proper hygiene and medical knowledge. Moreover, the symptoms he described are quite consistent with the then medical records of Lihorodka's rheumatic fever. The real source and main catalyst of this myth, which gave it a truly worldwide fame, is Mozart and Salieri, a small tragedy by Alexander Pushkin, written in 1830. Pushkin, relying on widespread but unconfirmed rumors, created a vivid, psychologically deep drama about envy and crime. In this piece, Salieri confesses to poisoning Mozart, motivated by impotent envy of Genyi. Pushkin's work, being a brilliant fiction, became so influential that people began to perceive it as a historical fact. Later, based on Pushkin's play, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov wrote an opera, and then, in the 20th century, it was adapted by Peter Shaffer for his famous play Amadeus, on which the film was made. It was Forman's film, with its visual and emotional power that finally cemented this false image in the minds of millions of people around the world. Sam Antonio Salieri himself, who outlived Mozart by several decades, suffered from these rumors for the rest of his life. Already in his old age, on his deathbed, he was forced to officially deny his involvement in the death of Mozart, but the shadow of slander haunted him to the end. Music historians have long since rehabilitated Salieri, recognizing him as a talented and hardworking composer, teacher. Among his students were Beethoven, Schubert, and Liszt, and a significant figure in musical history. His music, while not reaching the depth and versatility of Mozart, nevertheless deserves recognition. Thus, the story of Mozart and Salieri is a vivid example of how fiction based on false rumors can completely rewrite historical reality in the public consciousness. It demonstrates the power of narrative over fact and shows how the desire for drama can create a persistent myth that unfairly denigrates a real historical character. Debunking this myth allows us not only to pay tribute to both composers, but also to learn to be more critical of historical subjects, especially those that are so effectively represented in art. Medieval hygiene, an era of ubiquitous filth and lack of baths. In the mass consciousness, the Middle Ages are often associated with the era of total unsanitary conditions, widespread dirt, disgusting smells, and a complete lack of personal hygiene. This image portrays the Europeans of that time as people who fundamentally did not wash, lived among sewage, and whose cities were hotbeds of disease solely because of neglect of cleanliness. It is believed that the Christian Church, supposedly considering the purity of the body sinful, actively prevented washing in mass epidemics, such as the Black Death, were a direct consequence of this total unsanitary situation. This myth is often used to contrast the dark Middle Ages with the enlightened ones of antiquity, with its Roman baths, and the Renaissance, as well as to create a sense of the superiority of modern civilization. However, a thorough study of historical sources, archaeological data, and new research in the field of medieval life categorically refutes this extremely simplified and unfair Black legend about medieval uncleanness. In fact, medieval society, while different from our modern standards of hygiene, was not an era of total abandonment of washing. The idea of the dirty Middle Ages is largely a product of Puritan and Victorian views of history, as well as a consequence of the erroneous interpretation of some later phenomena. In the early and high Middle Ages, approximately from the 5th to the 13th centuries, we find plenty of evidence to indicate a relatively high degree of concern for cleanliness, especially among the nobility, clergy, and cities. First, public baths were common in the Middle Ages in many parts of Europe, especially in large cities. Although they may not have reached the scale and luxury of Roman baths, they nevertheless existed and were actively used by the population. In medieval cities such as Paris, London, Cologne, and others, there were public baths that served not only a hygienic, but also a social function, similar to modern spa centers. People regularly visited them to wash, relax, and socialize. In Germany, for example, Stuben, baths were very popular. Viking graves contain items such as ear spoons and tweezers that indicate self-care. Even in rural areas, people washed in rivers, streams, or at home in wooden tubs, using herbs and ash as detergents. Secondly, the Christian Church, contrary to popular myth, did not prohibit or condemn washing. On the contrary, many monastic statutes, such as those of Saint Benedict, required monks to maintain a clean body, and monasteries often had baths and even plumbing systems for hygienic purposes. Although asceticism and the rejection of excessive bodily pleasures were part of Christian doctrine, this did not mean a complete rejection of hygiene. The idea that cleanliness of the body is a sin originated much later, mainly among some radical Puritan sects during the Reformation, and was directed against hedonism rather than against washing itself. Third, personal hygiene was important for many medieval people. Nobles and wealthy townspeople often had their own bathrooms or portable baths. They used a variety of perfumed oils, herbs, and aromatic waters to maintain freshness. Washing your hands before eating was a ubiquitous and strictly observed tradition, as reflected in many medieval texts and images. Cleanliness of clothing was also important, and it was washed regularly, although not as often as today. So why did the myth of the dirty Middle Ages come into being? This is partly due to the fact that the situation with hygiene really worsened in later periods, especially in the 15th and 17th centuries, after the great geographical discoveries and the beginning of the early modern era. It was then that the spread of diseases such as syphilis, which was mistakenly thought to be spread through water, led to the fact that public baths became associated with hotbeds of infection. In addition, the perception of medicine has changed. Doctors began to recommend avoiding washing, believing that hot water opens the pores and makes the body vulnerable to diseases. At this time, France, for example, experienced a period when the e-book became less popular, which was then mistakenly projected throughout the Middle Ages. In addition, the myth was actively maintained and developed during the Enlightenment and the Victorian era. Enlightenment thinkers sought to discredit the Middle Ages as a dark and ignorant time in order to elevate their own ideals of reason and progress. The image of the dirty and backward Middle Ages fit perfectly into this rhetoric. Victorians, on the other hand, being obsessed with hygiene and cleanliness, but having limited knowledge of real medieval life, easily accepted this narrative, reinforcing it with their preconceived notions of the past. Thus, the idea of universal medieval filth and lack of hygiene is a simplistic and unfair myth. The Middle Ages were a complex period, and hygiene standards varied by region, social class, and time. Although they certainly differed from the modern ones, it is incorrect to speak of a complete lack of care for cleanliness. Debunking this myth allows us not only to see the Middle Ages in a more appropriate light, but also to understand how historical narratives can be distorted to suit ideological goals and modern biases, creating false contrasts and simplifying the rich and multifaceted picture of human history. Leonardo da Vinci's Renaissance Man, the myth of universal undervaluation in life. The image of Leonardo da Vinci in the modern consciousness is inextricably linked with the concept of the Renaissance man, a universal genius who was ahead of his time, a master in many fields. Artist, inventor, scientist, anatomist, engineer. We have come to think of him as a figure whose historical genius was not fully understood and appreciated until centuries after his death. While in his lifetime he was supposedly misunderstood, underestimated, or even rejected by his contemporaries. This myth, often reinforced by stories of unfinished projects and misunderstandings about his innovative ideas, creates a dramatic narrative about a genius ahead of his time. However, an in-depth study of historical documents in the context of his life shows that Leonardo was a very well-known, respected, and sought-after figure during his lifetime. And it is a significant exaggeration to talk about his general underestimation. Leonardo was certainly a unique personality, but the idea of him as a completely unrecognized genius whose ideas were too revolutionary for his contemporaries is not true. He was a very prominent figure in his time, working under the patronage of the most powerful and influential people of his age. His career spanned the courts of Milan, Florence, and later France, which in itself indicates his high demand. In Milan, for example, he spent much of his adult life, from 1482 to 1499, under the patronage of Duke Lodovico Sforza. The Duke commissioned him not only for artistic projects, such as the fresco of the Last Supper and the statue of Francesco Sforza's equestrian monument, unfinished but known as the Gran Cavallo, but also employed him as a military engineer, architect, organizer of court festivities, and even a hydraulic engineer. The Last Supper was immediately recognized as a masterpiece and became one of the most revered and copied works of its time. The fact that Leonardo switched freely between art and engineering, and that his work was highly regarded by the ruler of one of Italy's most powerful city-states, is completely out of keeping with the image of an unrecognized genius. After the fall of Sforza, Leonardo returned to Florence, where he was soon commissioned to create the famous Mona Lisa. Although the Mona Lisa did not gain its current cult fame until the 19th century, it was nevertheless highly regarded during Leonardo's lifetime. He continued to work on it for the rest of his life and even took it with him to France, which speaks to his own affection for it, but also to its recognition as an important work. It is also important to remember that Leonardo was a master of portraiture, and his work was in demand. His scientific research, recorded in his famous notebooks and codices, was indeed much less accessible to the general public. Leonardo kept his notes in a mirror handwriting, which made them difficult to read, and he rarely published his scientific works. However, this was more a consequence of his own way of working, the constant development of ideas, and perhaps the desire to preserve intellectual property, and not because his ideas were too revolutionary. Some of his anatomical and engineering sketches were known to a narrow circle of scientists and artists, and they aroused admiration and interest, not misunderstanding. Leonardo spent the last years of his life in France under the patronage of King Francis Schertners. The king offered him comfortable accommodation in the castle of Clos-Luz, the honorary title of the king's first artist, engineer, and architect, and complete freedom for research and creativity. Francis Schertner had great respect for Leonardo and considered him the greatest mind of his time. This period of Leonardo's life, when he enjoyed unprecedented freedom and royal support, is another powerful argument against the myth of his undervaluation. The king literally kept Leonardo by his side until his death. The myth of Leonardo's undervaluation probably arose in later eras, when his many unfinished projects and hidden scientific notebooks became known. In the 19th century, during the Romantic era, it became popular to idealize a lonely, misunderstood genius suffering from the ignorance of the crowd. Leonardo, with his versatility and mystery, was ideally suited for this role. However, this romanticized view distorts reality. Leonardo da Vinci was not only a genius, but also a highly successful professional who was able to find patrons, worked effectively in difficult court conditions, and whose talents were recognized and highly paid by influential people of his time. His incompleteness was often due to his own desire for perfectionism and constant experimentation, rather than a lack of recognition. Debunking this myth allows us to see Leonardo not as a hermit suffering from misunderstanding, but as an active, popular, and influential figure of the Renaissance, whose genius was quite obvious to his contemporaries. Salem witch trials were the witches burned at the stake, exposing the fallacy in scale. The Salem witch trials of 1692-1693 in the small Puritan settlement of Salem Village, which is now part of Danvers, colonial Massachusetts, have gone down in history as one of the darkest and most frightening examples of mass hysteria, religious fanaticism, unfair prosecution, and tragic miscarriage of justice. In popular culture, this episode is often depicted with harrowing scenes of women being burned at the stake en masse for witchcraft, which adds to the sense of horror, pain, and injustice experienced by the victims. The image of witches. Burning at bonfires in harsh and God-fearing New England has become a powerful symbol of religious fanaticism, mob madness, and the struggle for freedom of thought and religion. However, despite the undeniable tragedy, disgrace, and profound impact of these events on American law and culture, the myth of the burning of the Salem witches at the stake is categorically incorrect and a deep historical misconception. It does not correspond either to the actual scale and methods of punishment used in colonial America, or, more importantly, to the legal practice of that time and place. To begin with, it is imperative that this be made clear and unambiguous. None of the victims of the Salem witch trials were burned at the stake. This method of execution, which is so often mistakenly associated with Salem, was simply not provided for by English law, which was enforced in the English colonies of North America. In England and its territories, the crime of witchcraft was considered an imprestiplanum, a felony, and it was punishable by hanging. All 19 people who were convicted of witchcraft during the Salem trials and sentenced to death were hanged on Garrow Hill. Among those executed were both women and men. In addition, one man, an 81-year-old farmer named Giles Corey, refused to plead guilty or not guilty, i.e., he did not accept the court, so that his property would not be confiscated and could pass to his heirs. For this, he was subjected to the agonizing torture of peine forte dure. He was slowly crushed to death with heavy stones to force him to speak out. It was certainly a brutal and barbaric execution, but it also had nothing to do with burning. Thus, although the victims of the Salem trials were subjected to indescribable unfair persecution and cruel deaths, they did not burn at the stake. The myth of burning probably stems from European, continental, medieval, and early modern witch trials, where burning was indeed a common and legal form of execution for heresy, which often included witchcraft, seeing it as an abnegation of God or blasphemy. In regions such as the Holy Roman Empire, modern-day Germany, France, Switzerland, Italy, or Spain, the burning of heretics and sorcerers was rooted in Roman law and ecclesiastical jurisprudence. However, as already mentioned, English common law, the common law which the colonists brought with them to America and on which the legal system of the colonies was based, never provided for burning as a punishment for witchcraft. In England, as in its North American colonies, witchcraft was considered a felony and punished by hanging, just like other serious crimes such as murder or grand theft. In addition, it is worth noting that the scale of the Salem trials, although a local tragedy that left a deep, lasting mark on American history and served as a lesson for future generations about the importance of fair trials and the separation of church and state, was significantly smaller than the European witch hunts. In a relatively short period of time, about 200 people were indicted in Salem, of which 20 were executed. This contrasts with the tens of thousands, and possibly hundreds of thousands, of people who were executed for witchcraft in Europe over several centuries. Scientific estimates range from 40,000 to 50,000, with the vast majority of them executed by burning. That is, the Salem events were a terrible local tragedy, but they are not the typical or most widespread example of a witch hunt in world history. The myth of the Salem witch burnings most likely formed as a mixture of two powerful factors: the fusion of European and American traditions, where in the popular mind, European practices of witch burnings were mistakenly transferred to American soil, creating a more dramatic, terrifying, and visually shocking image, and the need for a powerful symbol. The burning witch idea is an extremely powerful, vivid, and emotionally charged image that is perfect for illustrating extreme religious bigotry, intolerance, mass hysteria, and injustice. This image reinforces the moral lesson about the need to protect individual freedoms, critical thinking, and the rule of law. It has often been used in fiction, public art, and political debates to denounce any form of religious fanaticism or witch hunting in a metaphorical sense, thereby perpetuating a false visual pattern. Debunking this myth in no way detracts from the horror and injustice that occurred in Salem. People were falsely accused, innocently convicted, and executed on completely absurd charges, often based on so-called phantom evidence, in the idea of ghosts of the accused tormenting injured girls, or the testimony of so-called injured girls, who often faked seizures. It was a true tragedy that profoundly affected American justice and culture. However, it is important to be as accurate as possible in historical details. Understanding that the execution was by hanging, not burning, helps to better understand the legal and cultural context of Puritan New England and avoid confusing it with other and European phenomena. It also serves as an important reminder that even in the case of well-known and widely studied historical events, details can be distorted or exaggerated in popular culture, requiring us to constantly be critical of information and strive for historical accuracy. Roman salute, or Nazi salute, ancient custom or propaganda fiction of the 16th century. The image of the Roman salute, raised straight arm, palm down, is strongly associated in the mass consciousness with ancient Rome. He often appears in Hollywood films about gladiators and emperors, in historical novels, and even in some works of fiction depicting the ant and the dragon. The gesture is seen as a symbol of Roman power, discipline, and grandeur, and its association with the 20th century Nazi salute only adds to the sense of its antiquity and perhaps ominous continuity. Many sincerely believe that the Nazis simply borrowed this gesture from the ancient Romans, thereby legitimizing their ideology by referring to the glorious past. However, a careful study of historical sources, images, and texts from the Roman Empire period shows that the so-called Roman salute, in its well-known form, was not a common or standardized gesture in ancient Rome. Its current form and association with Rome is largely a fiction and propaganda construct that originated in the 19th and 20th centuries. In fact, in ancient Roman sources, neither in written texts nor in the thousands of surviving sculptures, frescoes, coins, bas reliefs, or ceramics. There is virtually no unambiguous evidence of the existence of a single unified gesture of the Roman salute that would correspond to what we know as the Nazi or fascist salute. The Romans certainly used various gestures in their daily life, in rhetoric, in military greetings, but these were different forms. For example, a raised hand could mean an oath of allegiance, a salute to the gods, a call to the attention of the audience of the speaker, or a sign of approval, shocks, disapproval at gladiatorial fights, although here the exact gestures are not completely clear. However, none of these gestures were the straight, forward-reaching hand movement that became known as the Roman salute. Roman speakers, for example, often used a wide range of gestures, but they were more diverse and expressive than a single standardized salute. Images on Trajan's column or other monuments show soldiers and emperors using a variety of salute or command gestures, but they usually include bent elbows, hands pressed to the body, or raised fingers, rather than a straight outstretched arm. So where did this myth come from? The so-called Roman salute owes its origin to the art and culture of the 19th century, especially to the era of neoclassicism and Romanticism, when there was a revival of interest in antiquity. One of the key works that popularized this gesture was the painting of the French artist Jacques-Louis David, The Oath of the Hirashi, 1784. In this painting of Roman brothers swearing to fight for Rome, David depicted them with their arms raised and outstretched in a gesture that he himself probably invented or borrowed from theater productions of the time inspired by antiquity. This painting became incredibly influential and set a kind of visual standard for the Roman gesture for future generations of artists, sculptors, and theater directors. The idea that the ancient Romans did this was established through fiction, not historical evidence. At the beginning of the 20th century, this gesture was taken up and actively popularized by the Italian fascists under the leadership of Benito Mussolini. Mussolini, seeking to revive the greatness of the Roman Empire and create a new Roman Italy, actively used ancient symbols. He called this gesture the Roman salute, saluto romano, consciously trying to connect his movement with the heroic past. Fascist propaganda actively propagated the idea that this was a genuine gesture of ancient Rome, thereby giving it legitimacy and historical depth. From the Italian fascists, this gesture was adopted by the German Nazis and became commonly known as the Nazi salute or Hitler salute, Hitler Gruß. The Nazis also sought to draw parallels between their regime and the great empires of the past, a gesture perfectly suited to their purposes, symbolizing discipline, unity, and loyalty to the Führer. Thus, the Roman salute, in the form in which we know it today, is a modern invention and not a genuine ancient Roman custom. It was created by artists of the 19th century and then purposefully used and popularized by totalitarian regimes of the 20th century for ideological and propaganda purposes. Debunking this myth allows us not only to better understand the cultural practices of ancient Rome, but also to see how history can be deliberately distorted and rewritten in favor of political ambitions and the formation of a certain ideology, which in turn penetrates deeply into the mass consciousness through art and propaganda. This is an important reminder of the need for critical analysis of symbols and their supposed historical origins. Medieval chivalry, the myth of noble heroes in shining armor and their codes of honor. The image of the medieval knight in the mass consciousness is strongly associated with shining armor, nobility, impeccable valor, loyalty to the king and the beautiful lady, as well as with unwavering adherence to a certain code of honor, which prescribed protection of the weak, justice, and courtly behavior. This romanticized image, widely replicated in adventure novels, fantasy films, and even children's fairy tales, represents the knight as an idealized hero, the embodiment of all the highest virtues. We used to think of chivalry as a strict system of moral and ethical rules that disciplined the military elite and distinguished it from barbaric brutality. However, a careful study of historical sources, chronicles, and legal documents of the time shows that real medieval chivalry was a much more complex, controversial, and often violent phenomenon. Far from the romantic ideal, and the notorious codes of honor were rather a late idealization than a universally observed practice. In fact, medieval knights were primarily professional warriors whose main occupation was to conduct war. They were the product of a feudal system in which military power and land ownership were inextricably linked. Their lives were steeped in violence, and they were often far from noble ideals. Historical chronicles are full of descriptions of knights committing looting, violence, killing civilians, arson, and destruction. They often fought not only against external enemies, but also with each other, participating in feudal feuds that ravaged the lands and suffered from the destruction of their commoners. The concept of chivalry, as a certain set of ethical rules, began to take shape only gradually and was, in fact, a cultural ideal that was sought after, but which was rarely achieved. The so-called codes of honor, or chivalrous virtues, were not so much a strict set of laws as a set of ideals promoted by the church and literature, especially courtly novels. The church tried to civilize the military elite, direct their aggression in a more acceptable direction, for example in the Crusades, and instill in them Christian values such as protection of the weak, peacemaking, and justice. However, in practice, these ideals were often ignored. For many knights, the main values were fame, wealth, often obtained through violence and plunder, power and military prowess, rather than abstract concepts of honor. The courtly love of a beautiful lady, celebrated in troubadour poetry, was more a literary genre than a universal reality, and often had a superficial or even purely symbolic character. The armor that we see on knights in movies, full-plate armor, is also a source of myth. Full-plate armor, they appeared only at the end of the Middle Ages, in the 14th and 15th centuries. In the early and high Middle Ages, centuries, knights wore chainmail, helmets, and shields, which provided much less protection. The image of a knight in shining armor, able to single-handedly defeat dozens of enemies, is also an artistic exaggeration. The battles were chaotic and violent, and the knight's life, despite his protective gear, was extremely dangerous. The myth of romanticized chivalry emerged and became widespread in later epochs, especially in the era of Romanticism, 17th centuries. Writers, poets, and artists of the time, such as Walter Scott and Alfred Tennyson, turned to the Middle Ages as a source of inspiration, creating idealized images of knights, noble kings, and beautiful princesses, often ignoring or embellishing the harsh realities of that era. They sought to create heroic figures, contrasting them with prosaic modernity. These works of art had a huge impact on the mass perception of the Middle Ages, consolidating the myth of the Immaculate Knight. Thus, the real medieval knighthood was a much more complex and controversial phenomenon than its romanticized image. Knights were professional warriors, often cruel and pragmatic, and their codes of honor were more ideals that were sought after than universally enforced rules. Debunking this myth does not detract from their historical significance or military prowess, but it allows us to see them as real people in the context of their harsh times and not as idealized heroes from fairy tales. This is an important reminder of how easily history can be rewritten to suit the romantic or ideological needs of subsequent generations, creating false but persistent stereotypes. The myth of the Star of David as an original and exclusively Jewish symbol. The Star of David, or Magen David, Shield of David, a six-pointed star consisting of two equilateral triangles intertwined with each other, is today one of the most recognizable and powerful symbols of Judaism in the Jewish people. It adorns the flag of Israel, synagogues, Jewish books and ornaments, and in the modern consciousness is strongly associated with the millennial history and identity of Jewish culture. Many believe that this symbol has the most ancient roots, going back to King David himself, and that it has always been an exceptional and unique symbol of Judaism. However, careful historical and archaeological research shows that this notion is a significant myth. In fact, the Magen David became a widely and universally recognized Jewish symbol relatively late in history, and its use was not initially exclusive. Historical evidence shows that the six-pointed star, hexagram, was a universal symbol in many cultures and religions long before it became associated with Judaism. It can be found in Indian, Islamic, Christian, pagan, and even esoteric symbolism. In various contexts, it could mean the unity of opposites, earth and sky, male and female, harmony, perfection, or be a magical image. For example, in Islamic art, the hexagram was a common decorative element, often referred to as the Seal of Solomon, and can be seen on mosques and flags of various Muslim states. In Christianity, it was sometimes used as symbol of the creation of the world or as a decorative element in churches. As for its connection to Judaism, Magen David had no particular religious or national significance in early Jewish history. More ancient and significant symbols for the Jews were menorah, the menorah, seven-branched candle, the shofar, ram's horn, and the Lion of Judah. The hexagram did occasionally appear in Jewish art and on amulets, but usually as a decorative element or magical sign, along with other symbols. It was not dominant and did not carry the symbolic burden that it has today. In the Middle Ages, the hexagram was sometimes used in synagogues or in Jewish manuscripts, but its use was sporadic and non-exclusive. It was often juxtaposed with other symbols and was not perceived as uniquely Jewish. The widespread adoption of the Star of David as the main Jewish symbol occurred relatively late, mainly from the 17th century and finally in the 19th century. In the 17th century in Prague, Jews were allowed to fly a flag with a hexagram, which was one of the first official cases of using the symbol to identify the Jewish community. However, the real breakthrough occurred in the 19th century, when the Jewish population of Europe began to actively participate in secular life and nationalist movements. In search of its own easily recognizable symbol that could compete with the Christian cross or national flags, the hexagram began to gain popularity. It would have been visually appealing, quite simple, and by that time already had some historical associations, though not exclusive, with Jewish culture. The Zionist movement, which emerged at the end of the 19th century, finally established the Star of David as a universal symbol of the Jewish nation. It was the Zionists who chose it as the symbol of their movement, and then, after the formation of the State of Israel in 1948, it was included in its national flag, giving it unprecedented significance and worldwide recognition. The tragic experience of the Holocaust also paradoxically strengthened this symbol. The Nazis forced Jews to wear yellow stars, often six-pointed, for identification and humiliation, turning the badge they intended to make a symbol of shame into a powerful symbol of resistance, unity, and national identity in the eyes of Jews themselves and the world. Thus, the symbol, which was originally universal and only gradually acquired Jewish connotations, as a result of the tragic events of the 20th century, finally became fixed as the main identification mark of the Jewish people. Thus, the myth of the ancient and exclusively Jewish Star of David does not correspond to historical reality. This is an example of how symbols can evolve, acquire new meanings, and be nationalized at certain historical periods, especially in the context of identity search or facing external threats. Debunking this myth allows us to gain a deeper understanding of the history of Jewish symbols and see how cultural and political factors shape our perception of ancient signs. The myth of the Spartan, spirit, fierce warriors, and the 300 Spartans as an ideal created by the later Greeks in modern culture. The image of Sparta in the mass consciousness is an image of an idealized military state. Harsh, ruthless warriors who do not know fear and pain, from infancy brought up in the most severe conditions for war, living according to strict laws and sacrificing everything for the sake of the fatherland. The legion of the 300 Spartans, who stood to their deaths in the Thermopylae Gorge against the vastly superior Persian forces, has become a cult symbol of self-sacrifice, valor, and inflexibility of spirit, especially after the release of popular films. We used to think that the Spartans were the pinnacle of military prowess and uncompromising discipline. However, a careful study of historical sources and modern research shows that many aspects of this Spartan spirit are a significant myth, largely created by later Greek authors, and then romanticized in modern times and brought to the absolute in modern popular culture. In fact, the real Sparta was a much more complex and controversial society than its idealized image. The Spartan system, known as the Lycurgus system, was truly unique for its time and aimed at creating a powerful military machine. From the age of 7, the boys received rigorous military training, agoge, which included physical exercises, survival in extreme conditions, discipline and training with weapons. The girls also engaged in physical exercises to give birth to healthy babies. However, many aspects of this system are often exaggerated or misinterpreted. The legend of throwing weak babies from the Tayget Rock is one of the most common and violent myths about Sparta. Archaeological investigations on Tayget have found no mass graves of infants. Historians believe that sick or deformed children may have been left to die or be killed. But this was not the official, ritualistic practice of being thrown off a cliff, but rather a more pragmatic, but certainly cruel choice associated with limited resources and harsh living conditions. In addition, this myth is often confused with stories of children being examined by elders to determine their viability. But this did not mean an automatic execution. It is also worth noting that the Spartan society, despite its military power, was extremely stagnant and conservative. It developed little in the way of art, philosophy, or commerce, focusing exclusively on the military. This eventually led to its decline. The number of full-fledged citizens, Spartiates, who alone had the right to own land and participate in political life, was constantly declining due to wars and strict inheritance rules, which made Sparta vulnerable in the long run. The main population of Sparta was Helots, an enslaved population that cultivated the land and was a constant source of internal threat, forcing the Spartiates to constantly be on alert and suppress uprisings. The fear of Helot revolt was the driving force behind the entire Spartan system, which contradicts the image of free and noble warriors. The myth of the 300 Spartans. At Thermopylae, although based on a real historical event, has been heavily romanticized. Herodotus, our main source, describes not only 300 Spartiates, but also thousands of other Greeks, Thespians, Thessalians, and others, who also fought and died with them. The self-sacrifice of the Spartans was tactically justified. They covered the withdrawal of the main Greek army. The legend of their exclusivity and unique prowess was later created by Athenian authors and philosophers such as Plato and Xenophon, who, while criticizing Sparta for its authoritarianism, simultaneously admired its discipline and military prowess, idealizing it as a counterweight to the licentious Athens. The spread of the myth of the invincible and noble Spartans in modern times was due to classical texts and the desire of European thinkers and military figures for idealized models. In the 19th and 20th centuries, when nationalist and totalitarian ideologies were being formed, the image of Sparta, with its emphasis on discipline, self-sacrifice, collectivism, and disregard for individual freedom, was actively used for propaganda. Films such as 300 have taken this myth to its absolute limit, creating a hyperbolic image of the Spartan as a ruthless killing machine, completely ignoring historical nuances. Thus, the Spartan spirit, as we know it today, is more a product of later idealization and artistic interpretation than an accurate historical fact. Although the Spartans were truly outstanding warriors and had a unique system of education, their society was complex, with its inherent cruelty, slavery, and internal stagnation. Debunking this myth allows us not only to see the real Sparta in all its contradictions, but also to take a critical look at idealized images of the past, which are often used to justify certain ideologies or simply to create a spectacular but incorrect story. The myth of the mighty unicorn, a fairy tale creature or an error of interpretation and a product of symbolism. The unicorn, a mystical creature often depicted as a graceful white horse with a single horn spurling on its forehead, is firmly established in Western culture as a symbol of purity, innocence, nobility, and miracles. He is a central character in medieval tapestries, literary works, and appears in fantasy, children's fairy tales, and company logos. Many people perceive the unicorn as an ancient, perhaps even real-life species, about which only vague memories have been preserved. His image is so powerful that it seems as if he has been part of human mythology since time immemorial, always in the form of a graceful horse. However, a careful study of the history of this mythological animal shows that its familiar image and universal recognition as a horse with a horn are the result of complex evolution, errors of interpretation in medieval symbolism, and not a direct legacy of ancient legends. In fact, the origins of the unicorn myth are much more diverse and less concrete than is commonly believed. The earliest references to unicorn creatures come from ancient Greek and Indian sources, but they did not describe graceful horses, but rather wild, ferocious beasts. For example, the Greek historian Ctesias, who lived in the 5th century BC, in his writings on Persia and India, described an animal called Monoceros, which, according to him, lived in India. He described it as a donkey the size of a horse, with a white body, purple head, and dark blue eyes, and a single horn on its forehead that could be red, black, or white. This horn, he said, had healing properties. Later, the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, also mentioned a similar animal, but even more ferocious, with the body of a horse, the head of a deer, the legs of an elephant, and the tail of a boar, and with one black horn. These descriptions are very different from the usual image of a unicorn and are more like a rhinoceros or some hybrid creature. They were more like tales of outlandish animals based on inaccurate descriptions of exotic animals, such as the Indian rhinoceros or antelope with one horn when the second horn is broken or not developed. The transition from a wild, ferocious beast to a noble white horse with one horn took place in the European Middle Ages. This change was due to a combination of factors. Misinterpretation of the Bible played a key role. In some translations of the Old Testament, especially in the Septuagint, Greek translation, the word monoceros or unicornus appears, unicorn, to refer to a wild, powerful beast, for example, in the book of Job. It is assumed that it was a kind of wild bull or rhinoceros. However, over time, the literal interpretation of the one-horned creature led to its transformation into a European vision. Symbolism and allegory also played an important role. It was in the Middle Ages that the unicorn became a powerful Christian symbol. Its purity and purity became associated with the Virgin Mary and the incarnation of Christ. Legend had it that only a virgin could catch a unicorn, and it would come to her, lay its head on her lap, and fall asleep. This allegory was used to illustrate the Immaculate Conception. This symbolism significantly influenced the formation of his image as a pure and graceful creature. In addition, the unicorn horn and its value also contributed to the development of the myth. In the Middle Ages and early modern times, unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, it was an extremely valuable item, considered a panacea for poisons and diseases. This belief, propagated by merchants, further fueled the myth and fueled interest in the creature that supposedly produced the horn. The more valuable a horn was, the more majestic and mysterious its owner must have been. Thus, the unicorn we know today is more a product of medieval symbolism, Christian allegory, and commercial interests, rather than a direct reflection of ancient descriptions. His evolution from an Indian donkey or hybrid beast to a pure white horse with a magic horn is an example of how myths change and adapt to the cultural, religious, and even economic needs of his time. Debunking this myth allows us to gain a deeper understanding of the mechanisms of mythology and symbolism formation, as well as to see how our modern perception of ancient legends can be distorted by subsequent interpretations and artistic images. This is a reminder that even the most familiar fairy tale creatures have a complex and unexpected history. The myth of the immobility of the earth and the flat earth. How the Middle Ages invented these ideas. The image of a flat earth at the edge of the universe, from which you can fall, and a stationary earth in the center of the universe, around which the sun and all the planets revolve, is strongly associated in the mass consciousness with the Dark Middle Ages. It is believed that it was medieval churchmen and ignorant scholars who believed in these delusions, actively persecuting those who dared to assert the opposite, such as Galileo. This myth is often used to contrast the Dark Middle Ages with the bright Renaissance and Enlightenment, emphasizing their scientific superiority. However, careful historical research shows that most educated people of the Middle Ages, including church leaders and scientists, were well aware of the spherical shape of the earth, and the idea of a universal belief in a flat earth is a relatively modern myth that spread only in the 19th century. In fact, the idea of the spherical shape of the earth was known in antiquity. Ancient Greek philosophers such as Pythagoras, Aristotle, and Eratosthenes proved the Earth's sphericity and even calculated its circumference with surprising accuracy. Their works were available and studied in Europe throughout the Middle Ages. Such prominent medieval thinkers and scientists as Beda the Venerable, 8th century, Al-Biruni, ex-9th centuries, Thomas Aquinas, 13th century, and many others directly wrote about the spherical shape of the Earth. They used arguments based on observations, for example, how ships disappear over the horizon, or how constellations change as they move north or south. As well as logical reasoning, universities that emerged in the Middle Ages taught cosmology based on a geocentric but spherical model of the world. So where did the flat Earth myth come from in the Middle Ages? This myth is a product of anti-religious propaganda and romanticism of the 19th century. One of the key authors responsible for spreading this idea was the American writer Washington Irving, who wrote a biography of Christopher Columbus in 1828. In this biography, Irving, relying heavily on fiction, described how Columbus had to fight with church dogmatists and ignorant scientists who allegedly believed in a flat Earth and were afraid that his ships would fall off its edge. While history was fascinating, it was entirely fictional. In reality, Columbus' dispute with the ecclesiastical authorities was not about the shape of the Earth. They knew it was round, but about its size. Columbus mistakenly believed that the Earth was much smaller and that he could quickly reach Asia by sailing west. Other 19th century authors, such as John William Draper, History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, 1874, and Andrew Dixon White, History of the War Between Science and Theology in Christendom, 1896, made extensive use of this myth in their writings to demonstrate the supposed conflict between dark religion and theology, enlightened science. These authors, being proponents of progress and secularism, deliberately distorted history in order to discredit the Church in the Middle Ages as an era of ignorance. Their works were widely distributed and deeply rooted in the mass consciousness. As for the geocentric model of the universe, the Earth is in the center, the sun and planets revolve around it. Then it really was the dominant scientific model throughout the Middle Ages. This model was developed by ancient Greek astronomers, such as Ptolemy, and perfectly corresponded to the observed phenomena, explaining the movement of celestial bodies. It was accepted by the Church because it did not contradict the Holy Scriptures and fit well into the theological ideas about the place of man in the universe. The myth is not that it was believed, but that this belief was the result of ignorance or church dictates and not the advanced scientific thought of the time. The Copernican heliocentric model, in which the sun is located in the center, appeared only in the 15th century, and its adoption took time because it was more difficult to understand and required a revision of many established ideas. Galileo was punished not for claiming a round Earth, this was common knowledge, but for actively promoting the heliocentric model, which at that time did not yet have sufficient scientific evidence, as well as for a bold tone towards church authorities. Thus, the myth of the universal belief in a flat Earth and that the Middle Ages were an era of complete scientific ignorance is a modern construct generated by the ideological goals of the 19th century. Most educated people of that time knew about the sphericity of the Earth, and their model of the universe was, by the standards of that time, logical and scientifically based. Debunking this myth allows us not only to more accurately assess the intellectual achievements of the Middle Ages, but also to be critical of historical narratives that are formed under the influence of ideological or romantic motives. The myth of ancient Egypt, pharaohs, tyrants, and slaves, builders of the pyramids. The image of ancient Egypt in the mass consciousness is inextricably linked with the pharaohs, tyrants, who, with the help of ruthless power and inhuman labor of millions of slaves, built majestic pyramids. This image, reinforced by feature films and popular literature, paints a picture of mass forced labor, suffering, and disenfranchisement. We imagine armies of exhausted slaves dragging huge blocks of stone under the scorching sun and the blows of their overseers. However, modern archaeological discoveries and revision of historical sources show that the realities of pyramid construction and the social structure of ancient Egypt are significantly different from this common myth, and slaves in its usual understanding were not the main labor force at all. In fact, the pyramids, especially the Great Pyramids of Giza, were built not by slaves, but by skilled workers. Archaeological excavations that began in the 1990s have uncovered settlements of pyramid builders, their tombs, bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities. These discoveries give a completely different picture. The builders lived in purpose-built cities, were well paid, usually in food, beer, clothing, received medical care, and importantly were buried with honors near the tombs of the pharaohs. This indicates their high social status and significance for the state, and not the status of slaves. Among them were both permanent, highly skilled craftsmen, masons, architects, engineers, and seasonal workers, peasants, who were called up during a drought or flood of the Nile, when agricultural work was impossible. For the peasants, this was an opportunity to earn a stable income and food, as well as participate in a grand national project that ensured the afterlife of their pharaoh, and as a result, the prosperity of Egypt. The term slavery in ancient Egypt also differed from the modern understanding. Although slaves did exist, usually prisoners of war or convicted criminals, their numbers were relatively small, and they were used primarily in the household, in small jobs, or as servants, but not as the main labor force for large-scale government projects. The main labor force was made up of free Egyptians who paid taxes with their labor, participating in irrigation works, building temples, roads, and, of course, tombs of the pharaohs. For them, it was a kind of civic duty and a way of serving the divine pharaoh, who ensured order and well-being in the world. The myth of the slave pyramid builders has several sources. One of them is the Greek historian Herodotus, who lived in the V century BC, that is, about 2,000 years after the construction of the Great Pyramids. In his histories, Herodotus described the construction of pyramids using slave labor, but his information was often based on inaccurate local accounts and translations. He may have misinterpreted Egyptian terms related to forced labor or taxation, which did not mean slavery in our understanding. Later, the Bible, the book of Exodus, describes the enslavement of Jews in Egypt and their forced labor in the construction of cities, which also helped to strengthen the image of Egypt as a state based on slave labor. However, archaeological evidence does not support the existence of large-scale Jewish slavery in the construction of monumental structures. In the 19th and 20th centuries, with the development of Egyptology and cinema, the myth of slave builders was taken up and romanticized. Hollywood blockbusters such as The Ten Commandments depicted the pharaohs as cruel tyrants, and the construction of the pyramids as the culmination of slave suffering. These artistic interpretations, while fascinating, have cemented the wrong image in the mass consciousness, making it almost a universally accepted fact. Thus, the myth that the Egyptian pyramids were built by slaves is a deep misconception, based on inaccurate interpretations of ancient sources and romanticization in popular culture. In fact, these magnificent structures were the result of the organized labor of free, paid, and respected workers who considered it an honor and a duty. Debunking this myth allows us not only to better understand the social and economic structure of ancient Egypt, but also to understand how historical narratives can be distorted in favor of dramatization or certain ideologies, and how important it is to rely on the latest scientific data when reconstructing the past. The Mozart myth, a genius is a child who died in poverty and was forgotten by everyone. The image of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart in the mass consciousness is often a mixture of admiration for his genius and sympathy for his tragic fate. We present him as a prodigy who created masterpieces from childhood, but at the same time was impractical, wasteful, and at the end of his life died in poverty, buried in an unmarked common grave, forgotten by everyone. This dramatic story, popularized in such works as the film Amadeus, evokes strong emotions and creates an image of an unrecognized genius during his lifetime, whose true value was realized only after death. However, a careful study of historical facts and documents shows that many aspects of this tragic myth are greatly exaggerated or fictional. Let's start with the child prodigy. Mozart really was incredibly talented from an early age, showing phenomenal aptitude for music. His father, Leopold, actively promoted him and his sister, Maria Anna, now Earl, as wonderful children, organizing long European tours. However, contrary to popular belief, Mozart's early works, written as a child, were not immediately masterpieces of genius in the mature sense. Many of them were more exercises or imitations. His true unique style was formed much later in adulthood. He was constantly learning, developing, working on himself, and not just pouring out genius from birth. The myth of its poverty and oblivion also needs to be corrected. Although Mozart did experience financial difficulties in the last years of his life, it was not absolute poverty, and he was not forgotten. Mozart's problems with money were most often related to his inability to manage finances, rather than lack of income. He was a highly sought-after composer, pianist, and teacher in Vienna. His operas, such as The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni, were successful, although they did not always bring him fabulous riches, especially outside of Vienna. He received commissions from the aristocracy, gave concerts, academies that were well attended, and had regular students. For example, in 1787, he received a salary from Emperor Joseph II. The problem was his profligate lifestyle, excessive generosity, excitement, and inability to save money. He lived on the means of a rich aristocrat, not a working musician. When Mozart died in 1791, he was not forgotten. His funeral, though modest by modern standards, was attended by friends, colleagues, and students. The myth that his body was thrown into an unmarked mass grave also needs to be clarified. He was buried in the St. Mark's Cemetery outside Vienna, in a so-called common grave, Schachtgräber. However, it was not a mass grave for the poor or the unidentified. According to the then Austrian laws to save land and for reasons of hygiene, most people were buried in such common places, graves, Schachtgräber, where several, but not many coffins, were placed in one pit without identifying marks on the surface. This was a standard, if modest, practice for most citizens who did not belong to the upper aristocracy, and did not mean oblivion or disgrace. Expensive individual crypts were available to very few people. Later, when the location of his grave was lost, this only reinforced the myth of his poverty and oblivion. Mozart's popularity grew rapidly after his death. His works were actively performed, published, and studied. Composers such as Beethoven admired him. The myth of his tragic and forgotten life was largely formed in the 19th century during the Romantic era, when the image of a suffering genius, whose true value was underestimated during his lifetime, was popular. The film Amadeus, 1984, based on Peter Shaffer's play, although a brilliant work of art, further cemented this dramatic but historically inaccurate image. Thus, the myth of Mozart as an unrecognized, poverty-stricken, and forgotten genius is a significant exaggeration and the result of romanticizing his biography. Mozart was a recognized, highly paid, and successful composer of his time, although he experienced financial difficulties due to his lifestyle. Debunking this myth allows us not only to more accurately assess the life and career of one of the greatest commentators in history, but also to take a critical view of those dramatic stories that are created to increase emotional impact, but do not always correspond to the historical truth. The myth of the mighty unicorn, a fairy tale creature or an error of interpretation and a product of symbolism. The unicorn, a mystical creature often depicted as a graceful white horse with a single horn spiraling on its forehead, is firmly established in Western culture as a symbol of purity, innocence, nobility, and miracles. He is a central character in medieval tapestries, literary works, and appears in fantasy, children's fairy tales, and company logos. Many people perceive the unicorn as an ancient, perhaps even real-life species, about which only vague memories have been preserved. His image is so powerful that it seems as if he has been part of human mythology since time immemorial, always in the form of a graceful horse. However, a careful study of the history of this mythological animal shows that its familiar image in universal recognition as a horse with a horn are the result of complex evolution, errors of interpretation, and medieval symbolism, and not a direct legacy of ancient legends. In fact, the origins of the unicorn myth are much more diverse and less concrete than is commonly believed. The earliest references to unicorn creatures come from ancient Greek and Indian sources, but they did not describe graceful horses, but rather wild, ferocious beasts. For example, the Greek historian Ctesias, who lived in the 5th century BC, in his writings on Persia and India, described an animal called monoceros, which, according to him, lived in India. He described it as a donkey the size of a horse, with a white body, purple head, and dark blue eyes, and a single horn on its forehead that could be red, black, or white. This horn, he said, had healing properties. Later, the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, also mentioned a similar animal, but even more ferocious, with the body of a horse, the head of a deer, the legs of an elephant, and the tail of a boar, and with one black horn. These descriptions are very different from the usual image of a unicorn and are more like a rhinoceros or some hybrid creature. They were more like tales of outlandish animals based on inaccurate descriptions of exotic animals, such as the Indian rhinoceros or antelope with one horn, when the second horn is broken or not developed. The transition from a wild, ferocious beast to a noble white horse with one horn took place in the European Middle Ages. This change was due to a combination of factors. Misinterpretation of the Bible played a key role. In some translations of the Old Testament, especially in the Septuagint, Greek translation, the word monoceros or unicornus appears, unicorn, to refer to a wild, powerful beast, for example, in the book of Job. It is assumed that it was a kind of wild bull or rhinoceros. However, over time, the literal interpretation of the one-horned creature led to its transformation into a European vision. Symbolism and allegory also played an important role. It was in the Middle Ages that the unicorn became a powerful Christian symbol. Its purity and purity became associated with the Virgin Mary and the incarnation of Christ. Legend had it that only a virgin could catch a unicorn, and it would come to her, lay its head on her lap, and fall asleep. This allegory was used to illustrate the Immaculate Conception. This symbolism significantly influenced the formation of his image as a pure and graceful creature. In addition, the unicorn horn, in its value, also contributed to the development of the myth. In the Middle Ages and early modern times, unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, it was an extremely valuable item, considered a panacea for poisons and diseases. This belief, propagated by merchants, further fueled the myth and fueled interest in the creature that supposedly produced the horn. The more valuable a horn was, the more majestic and mysterious its owner must have been. Thus, the unicorn we know today is more a product of medieval symbolism, Christian allegory, and commercial interests, rather than a direct reflection of ancient descriptions. His evolution from an Indian donkey or hybrid beast to a pure white horse with a magic horn is an example of how myths change and adapt to the cultural, religious, and even economic needs of his time. Debunking this myth allows us to gain a deeper understanding of the mechanisms of mythology and symbolism formation, as well as to see how our modern perception of ancient legends can be distorted by subsequent interpretations and artistic images. This is a reminder that even the most familiar fairy tale creatures have a complex and unexpected history. The myth of the immobility of the earth and the flat earth. How the Middle Ages invented these ideas. The image of a flat earth at the edge of the universe, from which you can fall, and a stationary earth in the center of the universe, around which the sun and all the planets revolve, is strongly associated in the mass consciousness with the Dark Middle Ages. It is believed that it was medieval churchmen and ignorant scholars who believed in these delusions, actively persecuting those who dared to assert the opposite, such as Galileo. This myth is often used to contrast the Dark Middle Ages with the bright Renaissance and Enlightenment, emphasizing their scientific superiority. However, careful historical research shows that most educated people of the Middle Ages, including church leaders and scientists, were well aware of the spherical shape of the Earth, and the idea of a universal belief in a flat Earth is a relatively modern myth that spread only in the 19th century. In fact, the idea of the spherical shape of the Earth was known in antiquity. Ancient Greek philosophers such as Pythagoras, Aristotle, and Eratosthenes proved the Earth's sphericity and even calculated its circumference with surprising accuracy. Their works were available and studied in Europe throughout the Middle Ages. Such prominent medieval thinkers and scientists as Beda the Venerable, 8th century, Al-Biruni, 7th centuries, Thomas Aquinas, 13th century, and many others directly wrote about the spherical shape of the Earth. They used arguments based on observations. For example, how ships disappear over the horizon, or how constellations change as they move north or south, as well as logical reasoning. Universities that emerged in the Middle Ages taught cosmology based on a geocentric but spherical model of the world. So where did the flat Earth myth come from in the Middle Ages? This myth is a product of anti-religious propaganda and romanticism of the 19th century. One of the key authors responsible for spreading this idea was the American writer Washington Irving, who wrote a biography of Christopher Columbus in 1828. In this biography, Irving, relying heavily on fiction, described how Columbus had to fight with church dogmatists and ignorant scientists who allegedly believed in a flat Earth and were afraid that his ships would fall off its edge. While the story was fascinating, it was entirely fictional. In reality, Columbus' dispute with the ecclesiastical authorities was not about the shape of the Earth, they knew it was round, but about its size. Columbus mistakenly believed that the Earth was much smaller, and that he could quickly reach Asia by sailing west. Other 19th century authors, such as John William Draper, History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, 1874, and Andrew Dixon White, History of the War Between Science and Theology in Christendom, 1896, made extensive use of this myth in their writings to demonstrate the supposed conflict between dark religion and theology, enlightened science. These authors, being proponents of progress and secularism, deliberately distorted history in order to discredit the Church in the Middle Ages as an era of ignorance. Their works were widely distributed and deeply rooted in the mass consciousness. As for the geocentric model of the universe, the Earth is in the center, the sun and planets revolve around it, then it really was the dominant scientific model throughout the Middle Ages. This model was developed by ancient Greek astronomers, such as Ptolemy, and perfectly corresponded to the observed phenomena, explaining the movement of celestial bodies. It was accepted by the Church because it did not contradict the Holy Scriptures and fit well into the theological ideas about the place of man in the universe. The myth is not that it was believed, but that this belief was the result of ignorance or church dictates, and not the advanced scientific thought of the time. The Copernican heliocentric model, in which the sun is located in the center, appeared only in the 15th century, and its adoption took time because it was more difficult to understand and required a revision of many established ideas. Galileo was punished not for claiming a round Earth, this was common knowledge, but for actively promoting the heliocentric model, which at that time did not yet have sufficient scientific evidence, as well as for a bold tone towards church authorities. Thus, the myth of the universal belief in a flat Earth and that the Middle Ages were an era of complete scientific ignorance is a modern construct generated by the ideological goals of the 19th century. Most educated people of that time knew about the sphericity of the Earth, and their model of the universe was, by the standards of that time, logical and scientifically based. Debunking this myth allows us not only to more accurately assess the intellectual achievements of the Middle Ages, but also to be critical of historical narratives that are formed under the influence of ideological or romantic motives. The myth of ancient Egypt. Pharaohs, tyrants, and slaves, builders of the pyramids. The image of ancient Egypt in the mass consciousness is inextricably linked with the pharaohs' tyrants, who, with the help of ruthless power and inhuman labor of millions of slaves, built majestic pyramids. This image, reinforced by feature films and popular literature, paints a picture of mass forced labor, suffering, and disenfranchisement. We imagine armies of exhausted slaves dragging huge blocks of stone under the scorching sun and the blows of their overseers. However, modern archaeological discoveries and revision of historical sources show that the realities of pyramid construction and the social structure of ancient Egypt are significantly different from this common myth. And slaves in its usual understanding were not the main labor force at all. In fact, the pyramids, especially the Great Pyramids of Giza, were built not by slaves but by skilled workers. Archaeological excavations that began in the 1990s have uncovered settlements of pyramid builders, their tombs, bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities. These discoveries give a completely different picture. The builders lived in purpose-built cities, were well paid, usually in food, beer, clothing, received medical care, and, importantly, were buried with honors near the tombs of the pharaohs. This indicates their high social status and significance for the state, and not the status of slaves. Among them were both permanent, highly skilled craftsmen, masons, architects, engineers, and seasonal workers, peasants, who were called up during a drought or flood of the Nile when agricultural work was impossible. For the peasants, this was an opportunity to earn a stable income and food, as well as participate in a grand national project that ensured the afterlife of their pharaoh and, as a result, the prosperity of Egypt. The term slavery in ancient Egypt also differed from the modern understanding. Although slaves did exist, usually prisoners of war or convicted criminals, their numbers were relatively small, and they were used primarily in the household, in small jobs, or as servants, but not as the main labor force for large-scale government projects. The main labor force was made up of free Egyptians who paid taxes with their labor, participating in irrigation works, building temples, roads, and, of course, tombs of the pharaohs. For them, it was a kind of civic duty and a way of serving the divine pharaoh, who ensured order and well-being in the world. The myth of the slave pyramid builders has several sources. One of them is the Greek historian Herodotus, who lived in the V century BC, that is, about 2,000 years after the construction of the Great Pyramids. In his histories, Herodotus described the construction of pyramids using slave labor, but his information was often based on inaccurate local accounts and translations. He may have misinterpreted Egyptian terms related to forced labor or taxation, which did not mean slavery in our understanding. Later, the Bible, the book of Exodus, describes the enslavement of Jews in Egypt and their forced labor in the construction of cities, which also helped to strengthen the image of Egypt as a state based on slave labor. However, archaeological evidence does not support the existence of large-scale Jewish slavery in the construction of monumental structures. In the 19th and 20th centuries, with the development of Egyptology and cinema, the myth of slave builders was taken up and romanticized. Hollywood blockbusters such as The Ten Commandments depicted the pharaohs as cruel tyrants, and the construction of the pyramids as the culmination of slave suffering. These artistic interpretations, while fascinating, have cemented the wrong image in the mass consciousness, making it almost a universally accepted fact. Thus, the myth that the Egyptian pyramids were built by slaves is a deep misconception, based on inaccurate interpretations of ancient sources and romanticization in popular culture. In fact, these magnificent structures were the result of the organized labor of free, paid, and respected workers who considered it an honor and a duty. Debunking this myth allows us not only to better understand the social and economic structure of ancient Egypt, but also to understand how historical narratives can be distorted in favor of dramatization or certain ideologies, and how important it is to rely on the latest scientific data when reconstructing the past. The Mozart myth. A genius is a child who died in poverty and was forgotten by everyone. The image of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart in the mass consciousness is often a mixture of admiration for his genius and sympathy for his tragic fate. We present him as a prodigy who created masterpieces from childhood, but at the same time was impractical, wasteful, and at the end of his life died in poverty, buried in an unmarked common grave, forgotten by everyone. This dramatic story, popularized in such works as the film Amadeus, evokes strong emotions and creates an image of an unrecognized genius during his lifetime, whose true value was realized only after death. However, a careful study of historical facts and documents shows that many aspects of this tragic myth are greatly exaggerated or fictional. Let's start with the child prodigy. Mozart really was incredibly talented from an early age, showing phenomenal aptitude for music. His father, Leopold, actively promoted him and his sister, Maria Anna, Nannerl, as wonderful children, organizing long European tours. However, contrary to popular belief, Mozart's early works, written as a child, were not immediately masterpieces of genius in the mature sense. Many of them were more exercises or imitations. His true, unique style was formed much later, in adulthood. He was constantly learning, developing, working on himself, and not just pouring out genius from birth. The myth of its poverty and oblivion also needs to be corrected. Although Mozart did experience financial difficulties in the last years of his life, It was not absolute poverty, and he was not forgotten. Mozart's problems with money were most often related to his inability to manage finances, rather than lack of income. He was a highly sought-after composer, pianist, and teacher in Vienna. His operas, such as The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni, were successful, although they did not always bring him fabulous riches, especially outside of Vienna. He received commissions from the aristocracy, gave concerts, academies that were well attended, and had regular students. For example, in 1787, he received a salary from Emperor Joseph II. The problem was his profligate lifestyle, excessive generosity, excitement, and inability to save money. He lived on the means of a rich aristocrat, not a working musician. When Mozart died in 1791, he was not forgotten. His funeral, though modest by modern standards, was attended by friends, colleagues, and students. The myth that his body was thrown into an unmarked mass grave also needs to be clarified. He was buried in the St. Mark's Cemetery outside Vienna, in a so-called common grave, Schachtgräber. However, it was not a mass grave for the poor or the unidentified. According to the then Austrian laws to save land and for reasons of hygiene, most people were buried in such common places, graves, Schachtgräber, where several but not many coffins were placed in one pit without identifying marks on the surface. This was a standard, if modest, practice for most citizens who did not belong to the upper aristocracy and did not mean oblivion or disgrace. Expensive individual crypts were available to very few people. Later, when the location of his grave was lost, this only reinforced the myth of his poverty and oblivion. Mozart's popularity grew rapidly after his death. His works were actively performed, published, and studied. Composers such as Beethoven admired him. The myth of his tragic and forgotten life was largely formed in the 19th century during the Romantic era, when the image of a suffering genius, whose true value was underestimated during his lifetime, was popular. The film Amadeus 1984, based on Peter Shaffer's play, although a brilliant work of art, further cemented this dramatic but historically inaccurate image. Thus, the myth of Mozart as an unrecognized, poverty-stricken, and forgotten genius is a significant exaggeration and the result of romanticizing his biography. Mozart was a recognized, highly paid, and successful composer of his time, although he experienced financial difficulties due to his lifestyle. Debunking this myth allows us not only to more accurately assess the life and career of one of the greatest commentators in history, but also to take a critical view of those dramatic stories that are created to increase emotional impact, but do not always correspond to the historical truth. The myth of the Victorian era, Puritanism and sexual repression as the only truth. The Victorian era, circa 1837-1901, is often associated in the mass consciousness with rigid Puritanism, strict moral norms, suppression of sexuality, as well as prudery and hypocrisy. We imagine a world where even the legs of grand pianos were covered with covers, where talking about bodily functions was taboo, and any manifestation of sexuality was considered a sin and carefully hidden. We find Victorian society hypocritical and oppressive, especially when it comes to women. This image, reinforced by fiction and literature, has shaped the image of Victorians as people caught in the grip of social decency. However, a careful study of historical sources and sociological research shows that this myth of total sexual repression and absolute Puritanism is a significant simplification and is largely erroneous. In fact, Victorian morality was much more complex and controversial than it is commonly portrayed. Yes, there was a strong emphasis on virtue, decency, modesty, and family values, especially in the public sphere and among the middle class. This was partly a reaction to the promiscuity of previous eras and a desire for social order against the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution and urban growth. However, this did not mean the complete absence or suppression of sexuality. On the contrary, the facade of austerity often hid a turbulent and sometimes shocking reality. Examples that refute the myth of total Puritanism are numerous. London and other major cities in Victorian England were centers of prostitution. By some estimates, there were as many as 80,000 prostitutes in London at the end of the 19th century. It was a huge industry that thrived despite official censure. There were entire neighborhoods where the sex trade was open, and many men, even from the upper classes, were its clients. Despite censorship, pornographic and erotic materials, books, prints, photographs, flourished and were distributed underground. Many Victorian gentlemen had collections of such forbidden literature and images. Some aspects of Victorian sexuality were particularly grim, such as the spread of sex tourism among Britons in Europe, and even more horrifying, the existence of child prostitution. The fight against the latter has become one of the motives for reforms, for example, raising the age of consent. Historical research shows that Victorians, despite their outward strictness, were no strangers to a variety of sexual practices, including homosexuality, although it was criminalized and suppressed, fetishism, and sadomasochism. This, of course, existed in secret, but it suggests that sexuality was not turned off, but rather that it was forced underground. Victorian medicine often associated masturbation with various diseases and insanity, which led to the creation of bizarre devices to cure this vice. The idea that women don't experience sexual desire was very widespread, but it was more an attempt to control women's sexuality than a reflection of it. The myth of total Puritanism was formed partly by the Victorians themselves, who sought to create an idealized image of society, and partly by subsequent generations, who may have reacted to this image by exaggerating its severity and hypocrisy. Fiction, especially satirical fiction, also contributed by satirizing Victorian prudery. Thus, the Victorian era was a time of deep social and moral contradictions, where rigid public norms coexisted with a rich and diverse hidden sexual life. Debunking the myth of total Puritanism allows us to see a more complex, multifaceted, and sometimes shocking picture of Victorian society, as well as to understand how easily our view of the past can be reduced to a one-dimensional stereotype. The myth of the medieval Inquisition, mass witch burnings, and incessant torture. The image of the medieval Inquisition in the mass consciousness is strongly associated with bonfires, mass witch burnings, continuous torture, and ruthless suppression of any dissent. Historical novels, films, and even some textbooks often portray this period as a dark era of religious fanaticism, where any suspicion of heresy or witchcraft could lead to a brutal death. It is believed that millions of people, especially women, were burned at the stake by the inquisitors. This myth creates a picture of widespread horror and arbitrariness, where church power was boundless and merciless. However, a careful examination of historical data and contemporary research shows that the reality of the Inquisition was much more complex and far less large-scale and violent than is commonly believed, and many of its most dramatic attributes are the product of later distortions. In fact, the Inquisition, as a system of ecclesiastical judicial proceedings, was not a single and universal phenomenon. There were various forms of it: the Papal Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, the Portuguese Inquisition, and the Roman Inquisition, each with its own characteristics, time of origin, and jurisdiction. The Inquisition itself began in the 13th century as a response to the spread of heresies, such as the Cathars, and was designed to bring heretics back into the fold, not just destroy them. Its purpose was to inquire, that is, to investigate and find out the truth. Mass witch burnings are also a mythologized aspect. The main peak of the witch hunt was not in the Middle Ages, but in the early modern period, 16th and 17th centuries, and it took place mainly in Protestant regions and not under the auspices of the Catholic Inquisition. In fact, the Inquisition, with its legal procedures and relatively strict rules of proof, was often more lenient than the secular courts and was skeptical of witchcraft charges, demanding convincing evidence. Cases of witch burnings, although they did occur, were far less numerous than is commonly believed and rarely occurred by direct sentencing. The Inquisition, the victims of the witch trials, numbered in the tens of thousands, not millions, and most of them died under the sentences of secular courts. As far as torture is concerned, its use by the Inquisition, although it did take place, was regulated and not widespread or arbitrary. Torture was not a goal, but a means to extract confessions. They were applied as an ultima ratio, last resort, and only after a thorough investigation of the case and their application had to be authorized by higher authorities. Confessions obtained by torture had to be confirmed the next day, without torture, in order to be considered valid. Moreover, the Inquisition used torture less frequently and more humanely than many secular courts of the time, where torture was widespread and often far more severe. The myth of the bloodthirsty Inquisition, responsible for millions of deaths, began to take shape in the 16th century during the Reformation, when Protestant authors used it to denigrate the Catholic Church. Later in the 18th and 19th centuries, during the Age of Enlightenment and anti-clerical movements, this myth was taken up and reinforced. Authors such as Voltaire used the image of the Inquisition as a symbol of religious obscurantism and despotism to criticize the Church and absolutism. The works of art and literature of Romanticism further dramatized this image, creating frightening but historically inaccurate pictures. Thus, the myth of the medieval Inquisition as a machine of mass destruction and continuous torture is greatly exaggerated and distorted. Although the Inquisition was an instrument of repression and had its dark sides, it was not the monster that the mass consciousness paints. Debunking this myth allows us not only to better understand the judicial system of the Middle Ages and early modern times, but also to understand how historical events can be purposefully distorted for political or ideological purposes. The Viking myth: horned helmets, fierce invaders, and indomitable barbarians. The image of Vikings in the mass consciousness is inextricably linked with horned helmets, bloody raids, looting, and indomitable, barbaric cruelty. We imagine them as giant, unwashed warriors who mercilessly burned monasteries, raped women, and killed everyone along the way, all for the sake of loot and glory. They are perceived as wild, uncivilized primitives who only destroyed without creating anything of value. This image, reinforced by movies, TV shows, and popular literature, formed the stereotype of ferocious and monotonous conquerors. However, a careful study of archaeological finds, Norse sagas, and historical documents shows that the reality of Viking life was much more complex, multifaceted, and civilized, and many of the popular attributes are the product of later artistic fantasies. In fact, the Vikings did not wear horned helmets at all. This perhaps most recognizable Viking symbol is a product of the 19th century romantic fantasy popularized by opera costumes. In 1876, the artist Carl Emil Doppler, creating costumes for Richard Wagner's opera, The Ring of the Nibelung, equipped the soldiers with horned helmets. This artistic freedom quickly took root and became a persistent stereotype, although there is no archaeological evidence of the use of horned helmets in battle among the Vikings. The only known horned helmet found in Vix, in Denmark, dates from the Bronze Age, long before the Viking Age, and was most likely used for religious purposes. Viking battle helmets were simple, conical in shape, sometimes with nose guards designed for protection rather than deterrence or decoration. In addition, the Vikings were not only warriors, but also skilled traders, artisans, navigators, explorers, and farmers. Their campaigns were only one aspect of their activities. They established extensive trade networks linking Scandinavia with Byzantium, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. They founded cities, for example, Dublin, York, and settlements, and not only plundered them. Their quarrels, drakers, were masterpieces of shipbuilding and allowed them to cross the oceans, reaching North America, L'Anse aux Meadows in Canada, 500 years before Columbus. They were outstanding metallurgists, goldsmiths, and woodcarvers, creating exquisite works of art. The myth that the Vikings were unwashed barbarians is also far from the truth. Archaeological findings indicate that the Vikings paid great attention to personal hygiene. Numerous self-care items were found: combs, tweezers, ear spoons, razors. They bathed regularly, apparently using baths or designated ablution areas. Compared to many modern Europeans, the Vikings may have been even more clean. Of course, the Vikings were cruel, as were many warriors of the time. Their raids were relentless, and their violence was commonplace. However, this is not a unique feature of the Vikings alone, but rather a reflection of the realities of early medieval Europe, where wars and looting were common. The idea of indomitable barbarians ignores the complex social structure of the Vikings, their laws, governance system, and rich mythological and literary heritage. sagas, scald poetry, which indicates a developed culture and a deep worldview. The Viking myth as we know it was formed largely in the 19th century during the period of national romanticism, when the Scandinavian countries were looking for a heroic past, and the rest of Europe found in the Vikings a fascinating image of noble savages or primitive warriors. This image was idealized and dramatized to create spectacular works of art. Thus, the image of the Vikings as exceptionally fierce, horned barbarians is highly simplified and inaccurate. They were a complex and multifaceted society, combining militancy with outstanding skills in trade, craft, and navigation. Debunking this myth allows us to see the Vikings in their true light as one of the most influential and innovative cultures of the early Middle Ages. The myth of the gold rush, getting rich fast and single adventurers. The image of the gold rush in the mass consciousness is strongly associated with quick and easy profit. Crowds of lonely adventurers who turn from poor to rich in the blink of an eye, as well as with the romance of the Wild West, freedom and unlimited opportunities. We imagine scenes where gold is literally lying under our feet, and every prospector can find a nugget the size of a fist. This myth, reinforced by Hollywood westerns and adventure novels, creates a picture of incredible luck and boundless wealth. However, a careful study of historical documents and economic realities shows that the reality of the gold rush was much harsher, crueler, and far less lucrative for most of its participants, and fast fortunes were the exception, not the rule. In fact, most of the prospectors who went to the gold fields never became rich. The vast majority of them either did not find anything at all or earned only enough to cover the cost of travel and food. The journey to the gold mines was dangerous and grueling, involving disease, hunger, cold, and attacks by bandits or indigenous people. Many died on the road or from exhaustion and disease already on the spot. The work of the prospector was incredibly hard and monotonous. It was grueling physical labor in extreme conditions. Prospectors spent hours standing in icy water, washing tons of sand and gravel in search of the smallest grains of gold. Even when gold was found, it was usually small amounts, barely enough to survive. Large nuggets, which are legendary, were extremely rare finds and got a few. The real gold rush fortunes were most often made not by prospectors, but by those who served their needs, merchants and speculators, selling food, tools, clothing, alcohol, and other goods to prospectors at inflated prices was a much more reliable way to get rich. In conditions of scarcity and high demand, prices skyrocketed. Saloon keepers, inns, and brothels. The entertainment and services offered to tired and desperate prospectors made huge profits. Carriers and suppliers, logistics of delivering goods to remote mines was also extremely profitable. Mine owners and companies. As surface placers were depleted, gold mining required more and more investment in equipment and labor. It was large companies, rather than individual miners, that began to extract the main profit. The myth of lone adventurers is also not entirely true. Although many set out alone, communities quickly formed in the mines where people joined together to work together and protect themselves, or became dependent on companies. The idea of freedom, it was an illusion. Prospectors were tied to their land, dependent on suppliers, and often fell victim to fraud, violence, or unfair laws. The myth of the romance of the gold rush was formed largely in the popular culture of the 19th and 20th centuries, when Hollywood began to produce westerns, and writers, for example, Jack London, although his stories reflect the harshness of life, but still wrapped in a romantic flair, created heroic images of prospectors. These stories emphasized individualism, the struggle with nature, and the possibility of getting rich quickly, while ignoring real suffering, poverty, and a high failure rate. Thus, the gold rush was a much crueler economic reality than the romanticized image. It was an era of hard work, frustration, and rare success, and real fortunes were made in maintenance, not in the mining itself. Debunking this myth allows us not only to better understand the economic and social aspects of this period, but also to be critical of the stories of easy money and quick get-riches, which often hide behind hard work and high risk. History, contrary to popular belief, does not always appear before us in its original form. Often, what we believe to be the immutable truth about the past turns out to be just a web of myths, distortions, and simplifications created by time, culture, and even targeted propaganda. We can easily believe in the image of the medieval Inquisition burning millions of witches on every street corner, in Egyptian pharaohs building pyramids with uncomplaining slaves, in a short Napoleon suffering from an inferiority complex, and in romanticized Vikings in horned helmets who only knew how to plunder and attack. These colorful, often dramatic images are firmly ingrained in the mass consciousness thanks to literature, cinema, and folklore. However, on closer inspection, under the magnifying glass of historical analysis, these seemingly unshakable facts crumble, revealing a much more complex, multifaceted, and sometimes unexpected reality. The reason these myths are so persistent is because of their amazing ability to simplify the world and make it more emotionally charged. The human mind tends to search for simple explanations, vivid antagonists, and heroic protagonists. The complexity, uncertainty, and grayness of historical realities often give way to a gripping narrative. Myths serve not only entertainment purposes, but also perform important socio-cultural functions. They can be used as a powerful tool of ideological influence, forming negative attitudes towards certain periods, as in the case of the Dark Middle Ages, opposed to the Light Enlightenment, or to historical figures. They can contribute to the formation of national identity by creating heroic epics, like Robin Hood, or conversely, demonizing enemies. Finally, myths fulfill our deep need for stories that provide meaning, lessons, or simply distract us from everyday life. Hollywood blockbusters, historical novels, and even pop music draw inspiration from these simplified images, strengthening their dissemination and anchoring in the collective memory. However, the task of critical historical reflection is precisely to debunk these myths. This is not an act of nihilism or an attempt to take away our beautiful stories, but rather a desire for a genuine understanding of the past. When we abandon the idea of a flat valley in the Middle Ages, we begin to appreciate the intellectual achievements of that era. When we learn that the pyramids were built by free workers, we rethink the social structure of ancient Egypt. When we understand that the Vikings were not only warriors but also merchants and explorers, we get a more complete picture of their civilization. This allows us not only to more accurately assess the contribution of different eras and cultures to the overall development of humanity, but also to develop an extremely important skill of critical thinking. In a world overflowing with information, where facts are easily mixed with fiction, the ability to question conventional narratives, search for primary sources, and analyze information becomes a prerequisite for living consciously. In the end, the truth about the past, even if it is less effective or familiar, always has more value than the most fascinating myth. It allows us to learn more precisely from the mistakes and successes of our predecessors and to build a more adequate future, a rediscovery of the world and of ourselves. Debunking myths is not destruction, but creation. It is building a stronger and truer foundation for understanding human history, which helps us become wiser and more discerning observers not only of the past, but also of the present and future.